In the year 711, a force made up largely of Berber warriors, operating under Arab command, crossed the narrow waters separating North Africa from the Iberian Peninsula. The crossing was not an isolated event, but part of a sequence of probing raids that had already tested the region's defences. The commander of this expedition was a general named Tariq, whose name would later become attached to the rocky headland where the army landed. Jebel Tariq, the Rock of Tariq, would eventually be known as Gibraltar. Within a year of this landing, the invaders met the army of the Visigothic Kingdom of Spain in open battle. The Spanish forces were led by their king, Roderick. Against expectations, Tariq's army emerged victorious. Roderick was killed, and the road into the heart of the peninsula lay open. The capital city, Toledo, soon fell. In the remarkably short span of a few years, the entire peninsula came under the control of the conquerors. As had happened in England centuries later, the outcome of a single battle reshaped the fate of a kingdom. Yet in Iberia, the consequences went far beyond the fall of a ruling dynasty. The conquest of the early 8th century marked the beginning of an Islamic presence that would last for centuries. Its influence would leave a lasting imprint on language, architecture, agriculture, and intellectual life. Over time, Islamic Spain would become a conduit through which advanced learning, science, and philosophy reached regions of Europe north of the Pyrenees. At first, this inheritance was met with hesitation. Later, it was absorbed with enthusiasm. The effects of this exchange would shape Western culture itself and would eventually travel even farther, carried to distant continents by European expansion. Much that followed can be traced back to that first crossing. For this reason, the history of Moorish Spain remains essential to understand. Yet understanding has never been simple. Modern perceptions have created their own barriers. Southern Spain is often presented as a land of romance and mystery, a place defined by passion, exotic beauty, and lingering echoes of an imagined past. These ideas did not arise in the Middle Ages. They took form in the 19th century, during the age of Romanticism. Writers and travellers from the English-speaking world played a central role in shaping this vision. Accounts by figures such as Washington Irving and Richard Ford portrayed Andalusia as a land suspended between dream and decay. Their books reached a wide audience and left a deep impression on how Spain, especially its southern regions, came to be imagined abroad. The influence of these portrayals proved enduring and still colours popular descriptions today. Any serious attempt to understand Iberian history must confront the Islamic legacy that shaped it. Yet the reality is often less theatrical than the stereotype suggests. It is unfamiliar, certainly, but not in the way romantic imagery implies. This becomes clear when considering one of the most celebrated monuments of southern Spain, the Great Mosque of Córdoba. Constructed over several generations from the late 8th to the late 10th century, it follows principles radically different from those of Western Christian churches. In a Christian church, architectural energy is directed toward the altar. Space guides the eye forward. In the mosque, there is no comparable focal point. Prayer may occur anywhere within the hall. The space is unified rather than hierarchical. Hundreds of columns support layered arches, creating an environment where sanctity is evenly distributed. The entire hall is sacred. Visitors often remark on the calm that fills this vast interior. The effect is deliberate, achieved through careful design and proportion. Yet the building also bears visible marks of conflict. After Córdoba was taken by Christian forces in the 13th century, the mosque was converted into a cathedral. Centuries later, church authorities decided to construct a massive choir structure within its centre. This addition disrupted the original harmony of the space. City officials objected, but their protests failed. When the Emperor Charles V later saw the result, his reaction was famously severe. Something singular had been damaged in favour of something ordinary. History has largely agreed with that judgment. The insertion of the choir can be condemned as an act of architectural insensitivity, but it was also a declaration of religious authority. That declaration mirrored an earlier one. The mosque itself had been built on the site of a former Christian church. Each structure asserted dominance over what came before. The building became a record of successive triumphs, carved into stone. Two ideas emerge from this story. The mosque was a stage for religious confrontation, and in its original form it represented a worldview distinct from that of Christian Europe. It was the visible expression of a different civilization. This contrast becomes clearer when attention shifts from architecture to smaller works of art, created around the same time. One such object is a finely carved ivory casket produced in Córdoba in the late 10th century, for a high official of the caliphal court. Despite damage and wear, its craftsmanship remains evident. Scenes of hunting, animals, and human figures unfold across its surface. The figures are natural and readable. Their actions are immediately recognizable. The object does not demand explanation. It invites quiet appreciation. Its beauty is confident and restrained, intended to please rather than to challenge. A very different impression emerges from a wall painting created in a small church in the Pyrenees around the same period. Here, the human figure is rigid and intense, its expression strained. The imagery is symbolic and unsettling. Meaning is not obvious. It must be learned. The figure represents prayer, performed in a posture unfamiliar to modern eyes. The accompanying bird symbolizes eternal life, drawing on theological ideas preserved in early Christian thought. Without that knowledge, the image remains opaque. This art does not soothe, it confronts. It reflects a world shaped by fear, suffering, and the hope of salvation beyond death. Ironically, it is this harsher image that belongs to the cultural tradition of Western Europe. The Islamic object, by contrast, feels more accessible to modern sensibilities. These examples cannot define entire civilizations, but they are not accidental. They reveal how easily misunderstanding can arise when cultures differ so deeply in how they see the world. And yet, these cultures did meet. Their encounter shaped Iberia and through it, much of Europe. That encounter stands at the heart of this story. The Iberian Peninsula was the region of Mediterranean Europe where Christianity and Islam lived in the closest and longest contact before Christian political power eventually became dominant. Elsewhere, Islamic rule was comparatively brief. In Sicily, it lasted less than 300 years, and in Greece, only slightly longer. In Iberia, the encounter was deeper, more prolonged, and more transformative. Its most visible traces remain embedded in everyday life, especially in language. Modern Spanish and Portuguese carry the marks of this long coexistence. Hundreds of commonly used words originate from Arabic. Many of them begin with the syllable al, a linguistic echo of their origins. These words cluster around practical fields that shape daily existence: agriculture, commerce, craftsmanship, and administration. Terms for crops, tools, markets, taxes, storage, construction, and trade entered the local languages during centuries of shared life. Other words came without the telltale prefix. The Arabic word for market gave rise to place names, still used today, including the central square of old Toledo. Olive cultivation provides another example. The names for certain olive varieties, the fruit itself, the oil pressed from it, and even the vessels used to store it all reflect Arabic roots. Maps of Spain and Portugal reveal the same pattern. Towns, rivers, and regions still bear names inherited from the centuries of Islamic presence. The influence is equally visible in art and material culture. A visitor who moves directly from the intricate surfaces of the Alhambra in Granada to the exuberant plasterwork of later Christian buildings immediately senses continuity. The later forms could not have emerged without the earlier ones. Across Spain, architecture and craft repeatedly reveal a debt to Islamic aesthetic traditions, especially in the use of brick, plaster, wood, ceramics, leather, and textiles. The impact on domestic interiors and decorative taste has not always produced harmony, but the direction of influence is unmistakable. Language and art are the most obvious areas of inheritance, but they are not the most historically significant. The Islamic presence in Iberia also helped shape a powerful national narrative. From the 9th century onward, Muslim control of the peninsula gradually retreated southward. By the late 15th century, only the small kingdom of Granada remained. In its place rose a series of Christian states that began as obscure enclaves in the northern mountains and expanded steadily south. Over time, they took on the names and territories known from medieval history: Leon, Castile, Aragon, Catalonia, and Portugal. The forces driving this expansion were largely practical. Population growth pressed against limited resources. Land was sought by nobles eager for wealth and power. Military techniques improved. Herding economies pushed livestock southward in search of seasonal pasture. Yet those who benefited from this movement presented it in loftier terms. Churchmen and royal chroniclers recast expansion as a sacred mission. Thus emerged the idea of a reconquest, a righteous struggle to reclaim land from foreign rule and restore Christian sovereignty. This story proved compelling. According to its logic, Iberia had sacrificed itself in the early Middle Ages to halt the advance of Islam into Europe. Centuries later, it redeemed itself through a heroic campaign sustained by faith. The cross reclaimed the land from the crescent. Like many national myths, this one inspired pride while also fostering exclusion. It helped justify intolerance and sharpen hostility toward outsiders. Its usefulness did not fade with time. In later centuries, Spaniards defending Catholic orthodoxy against religious dissent were encouraged to see themselves as heirs to an ancient struggle. In the 20th century, the same narrative was repurposed in international politics. Spain was presented as a historical defender of Western values, now standing against a new ideological threat. The symbol of the enemy changed, but the structure of the story remained intact. Another long-term consequence of medieval coexistence emerged in governance. Over centuries of conflict and accommodation, Iberian rulers developed methods for administering newly conquered lands and managing diverse populations. When Spain and Portugal later built overseas empires, these practices were readily applied. Colonial territories in the Americas were governed using models first tested in medieval Iberia. In this sense, early modern empires extended patterns formed centuries earlier. Much of Latin America's later history follows from this inheritance. Today, the most difficult aspect of this historical narrative is the hostility toward Islam embedded within it. How can a society acknowledge deep cultural indebtedness to a tradition it long defined as alien or threatening? For centuries, Muslims and African peoples were treated with suspicion or disdain. Reconciling this past with a balanced understanding of history remains challenging. These questions carry particular weight in the modern world. Recent decades have made clear the necessity of understanding Islamic societies on their own terms. Old habits of neglect or domination are no longer sustainable. If inherited interpretations of the past create obstacles to that understanding, then those interpretations deserve careful reconsideration. the reality is simple and complex at once. For nearly 8 centuries, Muslim and Christian communities lived, side by side, in Iberia. They shared land and resources. They traded, argued, fought, intermarried, misunderstood one another, and influenced one another deeply. Their coexistence was not orderly or peaceful, but it was real and continuous. Any narrative that reduces this experience to a single moral lesson inevitably distorts it. Ironically, the greatest beneficiaries of this prolonged interaction were not Iberians at all. Beyond the Pyrenees, much of Europe gained access to a body of knowledge preserved and developed in the Islamic world. Ancient Greek and Persian learning had been absorbed, translated, and expanded by scholars of the Middle East. From there, it spread westward across the Islamic world until it reached Iberia. In Spain, Christian scholars encountered this material and translated it into Latin. Between the 12th and 13th centuries, this flow of knowledge transformed European intellectual life. Through this channel came Aristotle, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and navigational science. Instruments such as the astrolabe made long-distance exploration possible. Later, scientific breakthroughs rested on foundations laid through knowledge, transmitted from Islamic Spain. Europe's rise as a centre of innovation owed much to its willingness to absorb and adapt ideas developed elsewhere. Islamic Spain was not a decorative curiosity stranded at Europe's edge. It was a central participant in the formation of the Old World civilization. So far, this story has been told largely from a Christian and Western perspective. It also deserves to be placed within the wider history of Islam. In the medieval Islamic world, Al-Andalus was often regarded as remote and provincial. Intellectual elites in cities like Baghdad or Cairo viewed it as a distant frontier. Yet from this supposed backwater emerged achievements of lasting importance: monumental architecture, refined craftsmanship, influential philosophy, advanced medicine, and enduring poetry. The contrast between its reputation and its output invites closer examination. Before continuing, it is necessary to introduce the land itself. Even naming it poses difficulties. Over centuries it has carried many names, each reflecting a different tradition or claim. No single term fits comfortably. Political borders shifted constantly. Religious labels obscure as much as they reveal. Ethnic descriptions mislead, since the population was always mixed. The people of the peninsula spoke Arabic, Latin-derived languages, and others, regardless of faith. For practical purposes, Al-Andalus refers to territories under Muslim rule. Other terms will inevitably appear, sometimes imprecisely. Such inconsistency reflects the complexity of the land itself. The peninsula is formidable in scale and structure. Its size rivals that of major European regions. Its landscapes vary sharply, shaped by mountains, rivers, and climate. Spain and Portugal together form one of the most mountainous areas in Europe. Multiple mountain systems dominate the land, dividing regions and shaping settlement. The Pyrenees form a northern barrier. Other ranges isolate coastal areas and interior plateaus. Rivers carve pathways through these barriers, draining mostly toward the Atlantic, with one major exception flowing to the Mediterranean. These geographical features shaped history. They influenced agriculture, trade routes, political boundaries, and cultural exchange. Over centuries, human societies adapted to these demands, developing distinct economies and institutions. Any attempt to understand Iberian history must begin with the land itself, for it imposed limits and offered possibilities that shaped every encounter upon it. Between these mountain systems stretches a vast interior plateau. Much of this land lies at a considerable elevation, rarely dropping below 1,200 feet. This central tableland, known as the meseta, is largely level, sometimes gently rolling, and often visually uneventful. Truly low-lying terrain exists only along the outer edges of the peninsula, forming a coastal belt that wraps almost continuously around it. In some places this belt is narrow, pressed tightly between mountains and sea, as along the southern coast beneath the Sierra Nevada. Elsewhere it spreads more widely, particularly along the shores of southern Portugal. In certain regions, the coastal lowlands push far inland by following the great river valleys, most notably those of the Tagus and the Guadalquivir. From this geography emerge three broad climatic zones, each shaping a distinct way of life. Along the northern and western coasts, the climate is Atlantic in character. Rainfall is frequent, temperatures are moderate, and the landscape is green. This region supported mixed farming from an early date, with livestock playing a more important role than crops. Fishing was also central to the local economy, tying these communities to the sea as much as to the land. The meseta presents a very different environment. Here, the contrast between seasons is extreme. Summers bring intense heat, while winters are long and often harsh. The soil is light and easy to cultivate, but natural woodland is scarce. Apart from scattered scrub, trees are largely absent. In the northern parts of the plateau, grain farming dominated. Further south, olives and vines became the defining crops. The open expanses of the meseta also supported enormous herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. These animals were moved seasonally across the land, travelling southward in autumn and returning north in spring, following rhythms that shaped both economy and society. Along the eastern and southern coasts, conditions change again. Frost is rare, rainfall is limited, and summer heat can be relentless. With sufficient irrigation, however, the soil is remarkably productive. These regions became zones of intensive cultivation. Multiple harvests could be taken each year. Market gardens flourished, crops unfamiliar to much of medieval Europe became staples here. Sugarcane, citrus fruits, rice, and vegetables introduced through Islamic agricultural practice. Even the names of many of these products preserve traces of their origins. These contrasts create enduring tensions between different parts of the peninsula. The interior and the periphery followed different economic paths. The south and east were generally richer and more densely settled than the north and west, at least until the rise of Atlantic trade shifted the balance. The pattern is visible in the distribution of ancient cities. From Roman times onward, major urban centres clustered along the southern and eastern coasts and in fertile river valleys. Only a few important cities developed deep in the interior, and those often owed their prominence to deliberate political decisions rather than natural advantage. Some rulers chose central locations precisely to assert control over the whole peninsula. Toledo was selected by Visigothic kings for this reason. Centuries later, Madrid was elevated to the same role. Other cities rose for different reasons. Santiago became important through pilgrimage. Lisbon and Corunna gained prominence through overseas empire. Bilbao grew with industrialization. Each case reflects how geography interacted with power, belief, and economic change. The rugged terrain of Iberia long made internal communication difficult. Before railways and engines transformed transport, movement across the peninsula was slow and costly. Roman roads provided vital arteries, maintained well into the early medieval period. These routes allowed armies to move quickly, a fact exploited by successive rulers, including the Berber forces of the early 8th century. Yet commercial transport was another matter entirely. Bulk goods moved at the pace of animals and at great expense. Overland transport cost far more than moving goods by water. As a result, the outer edges of the peninsula tended to look outward rather than inward. Coastal regions found it easier to trade across seas than across mountains. Catalonia's historical ties with southern France and northern Italy were closer than its connections with Castile. In the far west, prehistoric monuments in Portugal and Galicia resemble those found in Brittany and the western British Isles more closely than anything in central Spain. One relationship stands out above all others. Southern Spain and northwest Africa are separated by only a narrow stretch of water. At its narrowest point, the Straits of Gibraltar measure little more than 12 miles. The landforms, climate, and ecology on either side mirror one another closely. Andalusia shares more natural affinity with Morocco than with much of the Iberian interior. For long stretches of history, the two regions were linked by constant movement, exchange, and conflict. This connection would repeatedly shape events during the medieval period. A story circulated about the last days of the old Spanish kingdom. It begins with an early king who built a tower and placed inside it something meant never to be seen. The tower was locked with an enormous padlock. Before his death, the king imposed a rule on those who came after him. Each new ruler must add another lock, strengthening the seal and preserving whatever secret lay within. One reign followed another. According to the tale, 26 kings obeyed, each adding a new padlock and leaving the tower untouched. Then a young king came to the throne, proud and impatient, remembered in the story as Roderick. He refused to accept the burden of tradition. Against the advice of his counsellors, he ordered the locks broken. One by one, the padlocks were opened until the tower was finally unsealed. Roderick stepped into the inner chamber. On the walls were painted mounted warriors from the Arab world, armed and ready, with curved blades at their sides and spears raised in their hands. In the centre stood a table of gold and silver, studded with precious stones. Inscribed upon it was a claim that it belonged to Solomon, son of David. An urn rested on the table. Inside was a rolled piece of parchment. When it was opened, the message was stark. If the chamber were violated and the protection broken, the figures painted on the walls would cross into Spain, overthrow its rulers, and take the land. Versions of this legend appear in both Christian and Islamic traditions. It gathered force because it served needs on both sides. A conquered Christian population looked for an explanation that could be carried in a single human story. The legend provided a culprit, blaming the disaster on a king who broke sacred obligation and paid the price. For the conquerors, the same story carried a different comfort. It suggested that invasion had not been random. It implied destiny and prediction, a future already written long before ships touched the shore. Behind the legend, some facts remain solid. Toledo really was the political centre of Visigothic Spain in the 6th and 7th centuries. The city did have imposing public buildings and the trappings of a royal capital. Roderick did exist, and he was the last king of the Visigothic line. He did face an invasion from northwest Africa in the early 8th century. He was defeated and died in the attempt to defend his realm. Those basic points are not disputed. The difficulty begins when detail is added. There is no shortage of narratives about the conquest. The problem is that most were written long after the events. The earliest major Muslim historian whose name survives, Ahmad al-Razi, wrote in the mid-10th century, and even his account is preserved only indirectly through later transmission. Other compilations were assembled in later centuries, drawing on circulating stories, rather than direct observation. Major historians of Islamic Spain wrote from Morocco, not from the Iberian Peninsula itself, and some of the fullest works were composed many centuries after the invasion. These writers were often careful collectors of tradition, but they were not working with modern standards of verification. Their goal was usually to preserve what people believed and repeated, not to separate established fact from dramatic invention. Christian narratives suffer from similar limitations. The more distant the writer was from the 8th century, the more detailed the account tends to become, and the more strongly it serves the needs of later politics and identity. Chroniclers, writing in the 13th century, worked in a world shaped by crusading language, dynastic rivalry, and religious propaganda. Their histories often reinforced national myths that their audiences wanted to hear. Their methods were not built around critical testing of sources in the modern sense. Strictly contemporary evidence for the conquest is limited. Only a few pieces stand close enough to the moment to carry real weight. One brief narrative from the Christian side, one highly important administrative document from the Muslim side, and a small amount of archaeological evidence that can be linked to early 8th century violence. The most valuable written narrative is a short Latin chronicle, commonly known by the year of its latest entries, 754. It appears to have taken final form in, or shortly after that time. The author may have been connected to Toledo. Modern scholarship has often treated this text as more reliable than later accounts precisely because it stands closer to the events and is less shaped by subsequent myth-making. Its story is direct. Raids from North Africa struck parts of Spain in the early years of the 8th century, damaging several provinces over a period that lasted long enough to be remembered as more than a single incident. Then, in 711, the governor of North Africa, Musa ibn Nusayr, sent an army across the straits under a commander named Tariq. Another force, led by Musa himself, followed soon after. At the same time, Spain's political situation was unstable. Roderick became king in 711, but his claim faced opposition and internal conflict followed. In 712, a major battle was fought between Roderick and Tariq. The exact location cannot be identified with certainty today, though it seems to have been in the southern region not far from the coastal approaches. The result was decisive. Roderick was defeated and killed. After the battle, Musa advanced to Toledo. Executions followed. The surrounding countryside was devastated. Musa then moved northeast into the Ebro Valley and took Zaragoza, the major city of that region. The chronicle describes widespread destruction and heavy loss of life. The Archbishop of Toledo, the leading church figure of Spain, fled rather than remain. Before the end of 712, Musa left the peninsula, summoned by the Umayyad Caliph, to Damascus. He carried with him prominent captives and immense wealth in the form of bullion and jewelry. Before departing, he left control of the conquered territories to his son, Abd al-Aziz. Over the next few years, Abd al-Aziz extended and secured Muslim authority until it covered the whole peninsula. This account, plain and plausible, can be checked against outside evidence. The flight of Toledo's archbishop, for example, is supported by his later appearance at a church council beyond Spain. Archaeology adds further support in general terms. Some sites show signs of violent destruction around the years 711 to 713, with coin evidence helping to date the damage. It cannot be proven that every burned settlement was destroyed in the invasion, but the timing makes the connection likely. More discoveries may yet emerge as excavation continues. One dramatic archaeological find has long captured attention. In the 19th century, near Toledo, a hoard was uncovered that included votive crowns of gold and jewels, gifts offered by 7th century kings to a religious community. These objects had been buried for safekeeping during a time of danger and never recovered. Their survival suggests panic and uncertainty in the face of approaching catastrophe. It cannot be known exactly when they were hidden. It is possible they were buried as news spread of defeat in the south and of an advancing army. It is possible those who hid them were killed in the violence that followed. Certainty is impossible, but the crowns allow a glimpse of the wealth that could be seized and carried eastward as booty. The crucial administrative document comes from the early years of Muslim rule. Although it survives only in later copies, scholars generally accept it as authentic. It records an agreement made by Abd al-Aziz with a local ruler named Theodemir. The document is dated to early April 713 in the Christian calendar. Theodemir controlled a group of towns in the southeast of Spain, including a coastal centre and several inland places. He agreed to submit. In return, he and his people were promised personal safety and the freedom to practice Christianity in their churches. Theodemir was allowed to retain his authority. The agreement required loyalty. It also required an annual tax, paid partly in money and partly in agricultural produce, such as grain, grape products, vinegar, honey, and oil. This treaty hints at a broader pattern. Comparable agreements may have been made elsewhere, though few documents survive. In places that surrendered, local life could continue with minimal disruption. Landholders kept their estates. Farmers remained on their fields. Taxes were still collected, but now under new management. Only in cities that resisted did the conquest follow harsher lines, including executions and enslavement, outcomes that appear to have affected several major towns. These practices were not improvised in Spain. They followed precedents used earlier in Syria, Egypt, and Persia. Under Islamic law, Christians and Jews were recognized as protected religious communities. Negotiated surrender allowed Muslim armies to keep moving quickly rather than becoming tied down in constant garrison duty. This mobility helped explain how a vast territory could be brought under control in a short time. By roughly 720, Muslim authority had stabilized across the lands once ruled by the Visigothic kings. Those lands included not only Iberia, but also the Visigothic province, north of the Pyrenees along the Mediterranean coast, governed from Narbonne. That region too was drawn into the early wave of conquest. The identity of the conquerors deserves careful attention. The event is often described as an Arab conquest or an Islamic invasion. Both labels contain truth, but neither captures the main demographic reality. The forces crossing into Spain were largely Berber. The Berbers were the indigenous peoples of northwest Africa. They were divided into large tribal groupings that broke down into clans and family networks. Their economy leaned heavily on herding, seasonal movement, and raiding between groups. They traded, but many lived without strong urban traditions or a widespread written culture. Political organization tended to be local and personal, centered on elders and clan leadership. By the standards of the Mediterranean's established civilizations, they stood on a very different footing. The subjugation of the Maghreb was among the most difficult chapters in early Islamic expansion. After the death of Muhammad in 632, the Islamic Empire grew at astonishing speed, reaching far into Asia and across North Africa within a century. In North Africa, early conquests were directed against territories that still belonged, at least formally, to the Roman Empire based in Constantinople. That empire had been weakened by plague, economic disruption, and constant pressure from enemies. Egypt fell in the early 640s. The coastal regions of Libya followed. The province of modern Tunisia was conquered by around 670, marked by the founding of Kairouan. Yet, as Muslim forces moved westward, resistance intensified. Berber opposition was fierce, and even after nominal submission, rebellions continued into the middle of the 8th century. Arab leaders found one method of control particularly useful. Berber warriors could be encouraged, or compelled to join Muslim armies and fight in campaigns elsewhere. This served multiple purposes at once. It drew restless fighters away from rebellion. It exploited their military ability. It broke older loyalties by imposing new discipline. It also accelerated their incorporation into Islam through structured religious practice. The promise of plunder, adventure, and perhaps land made such enlistment attractive to many. This broader strategy helps explain why raids against southern Spain occurred repeatedly before 711. Why did raiding turn into full conquest? The sources are too limited to give a simple answer. Part of the explanation may lie in the nature of the early Islamic state. The Umayyad caliphs, ruling from Damascus, depended on the support of an elite with a strong warrior ethos. Continuous campaigning satisfied that ethos and helped maintain loyalty. In this respect, Islamic rulers were not unique. Early medieval Christian kings in other parts of Europe faced similar pressures from predatory aristocracies. Expansion was a way to survive. Stagnation could be dangerous. Environmental factors may also have mattered. Southern Spain resembles Morocco in landscape and climate, though it is generally less harsh and more productive. For Berber groups accustomed to the Maghreb, the pastures and valleys across the straits would appear tempting. Geography also shaped limits. Certain regions, wet and forested, held little appeal. Mountain barriers could slow or redirect expansion. Similar patterns can be seen elsewhere in early Islamic history, where major ranges created frontiers difficult to push beyond. The Pyrenees are easiest to cross near the Mediterranean coast, and this helps explain why Muslim forces entered the Visigothic territories north of the mountains. Yet their hold there was brief, lasting little more than a generation, shaped not only by terrain, but also by shifting political forces that would later determine the outcome. To grasp the conquest fully, attention must turn to what Spain had been before 711. The speed of the takeover is striking. In a few years, one battle followed by a short series of operations overturned the strongest monarchy in Western Europe. The same land had taken Rome centuries to subdue. Two different explanations can be held together. One points to the long legacy of Roman rule. Over 4 centuries, Rome imposed an organized pattern on Iberia. Latin became the language of administration, law, and elite culture. Military recruitment drew Iberians into the Roman system, and returning veterans carried imperial habits into distant regions. Trade bound the peninsula to the wider Mediterranean. Grain, oil, wine, minerals, and horses moved through imperial networks. A shared currency and relative safety encouraged commerce. Landowners and traders prospered. Large villas in fertile valleys reflect market-focused agriculture as well as elite wealth. Towns expanded and new ones were founded, leaving names that still recall their origins. Roman civic pride can still be sensed through surviving monuments such as aqueducts, theatres, and bridges, built to display power, order, and belonging within the empire. The road system and bridges were particularly important. They linked cities and regions into a functional whole and allowed rapid movement. Some bridges survived long after the empire's fall. One, crossing over the Tagus, built in the era of Emperor Trajan, impressed later rulers so deeply that it gained a new name derived from the Arabic word for bridge, a reminder of how conquest could preserve and rename rather than simply destroy. Another layer must be added to this Roman framework: Christianity. Spain was not necessarily converted in the earliest apostolic era, and later legends about specific apostolic missions cannot be treated as historical fact. Still, Christian communities appeared early in the Roman period. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the empire's official religion, bishops and churches were established in major towns. Rural regions likely converted more slowly, but the church created a strong institutional network that endured beyond the empire itself. When the Western Roman Empire weakened in the 5th century, new kingdoms emerged under Germanic elites. Yet these successor states were often deeply shaped by Roman culture. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain is a clear example. The Goths had lived for generations near Rome's frontier and had already absorbed elements of Roman life. In 376, they entered the empire as refugees under pressure from the Huns. Their subsequent migrations and clashes with Roman authority culminated in dramatic episodes, such as the sack of Rome in 410. Soon afterward, the Visigoths settled in southern Gaul under treaty and built a kingdom centered on Toulouse. In the late 5th century, they expanded into Spain and gradually made it their primary base. By the time Visigothic power was firmly established, the ruling class had largely adapted to Roman norms. They issued laws in Latin modelled on Roman precedent. They minted coinage echoing imperial styles. They maintained administrative habits inherited from the empire. They repaired public buildings and embraced Christian identity with intensity. Some even founded cities in an imperial manner, naming them to honour dynastic ambition and military victory. In effect, Visigothic Spain continued Roman Spain under new leadership. This helps explain how the conquest could be so fast. A centralised system with roads, administrative practice, and a capital could collapse quickly once its military core was broken. Similar patterns occurred elsewhere in the early Islamic expansion. When a decisive blow landed, highly organised states could fall with shocking speed. Yet the opposite point must also be kept in view. It is possible to overstate unity and order. The surviving written sources often reflect the viewpoint of the centre. Law codes naturally highlight kings and institutions. Much less is known about how power operated locally. In practice, the everyday functioning of rule depended heavily on regional elites. Landed magnates dominated provinces, controlled client networks, mediated between common people and tax collectors, provided employment and charity during hardship, sponsored public entertainments, and influenced local judges and bishops. For many communities, these figures mattered more than a distant king. A conqueror could exploit this reality. Rather than fighting every region to the end, it was possible to secure submission by negotiating with local power holders. Theodemir's treaty suggests exactly such a pattern. In that case, the conquest was not simply a wave of destruction. It was also a sequence of bargains that transferred authority while preserving local structures. One more element present in Visigothic Spain must be included: the Jewish communities. Jews had lived in Spain since at least the early centuries of the Roman era, and many appear to have been concentrated in towns of the east and south and on the Balearic Islands. Unfortunately, little survives from their own records beyond a small number of inscriptions. Most of what is known comes from hostile sources, especially laws enacted against them and preserved in Visigothic legal tradition. These anti-Jewish measures are severe and disturbing to modern readers. Two contexts matter when judging them. Across the Mediterranean world, persecution of Jewish communities intensified in the 6th and 7th centuries, including within the Byzantine Empire. Visigothic rulers were not acting in isolation. They were imitating broader patterns of imperial policy and religious coercion also seen in other European kingdoms of the time. At the same time, harsh legislation does not always reflect everyday reality. There are reasons to suspect that enforcement was uneven and that local circumstances often softened what official policy demanded. By the year 700, Jewish communities in Spain were likely deeply alienated from their Visigothic rulers. They were not isolated groups cut off from the wider world. Many were involved in commerce, and their ties to Jewish congregations across the Mediterranean meant that news travelled. Policies enacted by Visigothic kings would have reinforced resentment rather than eased it. One law issued under King Egica, for example, restricted Jews from taking part in foreign trade, a measure that signalled distrust and tightened control over livelihoods. At the same time, Jewish communities could hardly have been unaware that in regions such as Syria and Egypt, Jews were treated more predictably under Islamic rule than they had been under late Roman and post-Roman Christian regimes, since Islamic law recognized Jews and Christians as protected religious communities. It is impossible to know exactly what role Jewish leaders played in the conquest of Spain, if any. Still, it is not hard to imagine them helping to broker local accommodations, especially in cities where negotiation offered a safer path than resistance. At the very least, many may have viewed the newcomers with cautious goodwill, or with the hope that a change of rulers might bring relief. For roughly 4 decades after the initial takeover, Spain was governed by a succession of governors, whose base lay in Córdoba. In theory, these men were appointed by the Umayyad caliphs in Damascus. In practice, authority in the far west often flowed through North Africa. The governors in Spain appear to have been tied closely to the Arab leadership in Ifriqiya, whose centre of power stood at Kairouan. This period remains difficult to see clearly, but one key contemporary narrative, supplemented by scattered traces from elsewhere, allows the outline of events to be reconstructed. Several major developments stand out. First came the consolidation of conquest through land distribution and settlement. Not every aristocratic family of Visigothic or Hispano-Roman background was stripped of its holdings. Some local magnates survived by reaching terms, and the treaty with Theodemir shows how this could happen. Yet the estates owned by the Visigothic crown itself would almost certainly have passed into the hands of the new rulers. Land belonging to those who resisted, including supporters of King Roderick, or notables from cities that fought back, was also vulnerable to confiscation. These holdings created a pool of property that could be handed out to the conquerors. Reports indicate that during the governorship of a leader known as As-Sama, between 718 and 721, land was allocated by a process described as a lottery. Whatever the method, the outcome seems far from accidental. The Arab minority received many of the richest and most desirable areas. The Berber majority was often pushed toward less fertile districts, including parts of the interior plateau, the north, and rougher mountain zones in the east and south. This imbalance would not remain a quiet grievance. It planted a fault line inside the new order. A second development was the scale of migration that followed conquest. The number of Arab and Berber warriors who settled in Spain is often estimated in the range of 150,000 to 200,000. The bigger question is, who else came with them? If these men arrived with wives, children, dependents, and enslaved people, the total number of newcomers could have been several times larger. If many arrived as unattached fighters and then formed households in Spain through local marriages and the acquisition of slaves, the demographic impact would have been different. Both patterns likely occurred. In the absence of clear demographic records, only rough approximations are possible. Late Roman Spain is sometimes estimated at around 4 million inhabitants, and it is unlikely that the population had grown by 700, given broader patterns of stagnation and decline in early medieval Europe. Even a migration approaching 1 million people across the 8th century would therefore represent a major shift. But the exact scale of that shift cannot be measured with confidence. Meanwhile, the population of the conquered was reduced by several forces. Some died in violence. Some fled to safer areas, others were carried away. The Archbishop of Toledo, who escaped abroad, represents one kind of refugee. The high-ranking captives taken by Musa to Damascus represent another. In a later, striking episode, an Anglo-Saxon traveller passing through the eastern Mediterranean was reportedly saved through the intervention of a man from Spain whose brother served at a high level in the administration of Muslim rulers. Such glimpses suggest that some captives or emigrants found new roles in the broader Islamic world. Many others, far less visible to historical record, simply moved to regions of the peninsula where Muslim authority was weaker or where protection could be found. A third development was the retreat of Muslim forces from the Asturian region in the far north. This withdrawal coincided with the emergence of a local Christian leader named Pelagius. Later generations would elevate his struggle into a foundational national epic, but that was not how it appeared at the time. Pelagius did not launch a grand reconquest. He created a small stronghold in the mountains, a place of refuge for those who could not or would not live under the new order. Its future importance lay far ahead. In the early 8th century, it was only a small node of resistance, significant primarily because it survived. The fourth development unfolded beyond the Pyrenees. Expansion did not stop at Spain's northern frontier. Raiding parties pushed into Gaul, seeking plunder and captives in a pattern common to early medieval warfare on many fronts. Toulouse was threatened in 720. Autun in Burgundy was sacked in 725. The clash, traditionally known as the Battle of Poitiers, usually placed in 732, though likely closer to 733, later acquired a legendary status out of proportion to its immediate impact. Muslim forces continued to operate in southern France in the years afterward, including devastating campaigns in Provence. The deeper importance of Poitiers belongs largely to Frankish internal politics. It marked a moment in the consolidation of Carolingian power in Aquitaine, helping a rising dynasty secure authority in a region that had previously been only loosely controlled. Direct, sustained confrontation between Frankish forces and Muslim armies would later occur on and around the Spanish frontier during the reign of Charlemagne. Then came a turning point that reshaped Spain from within. In 739, the Berbers of North Africa rose against their Arab rulers, and in 740 revolt spread into the peninsula. The reasons for Berber anger were not hard to find. They had been conquered after years of bloody struggle. Many had adopted Islam, but conversion did not translate into equal status. Across the Islamic world, Arab elites often treated non-Arab Muslims as lesser members of the community, and contempt toward Berbers was common. In Spain, these wider resentments were sharpened by the unfair distribution of land. In such conditions, rebellion was almost predictable. The Berber uprising triggered years of turmoil in Al-Andalus. The revolt itself caused destruction, disrupted agriculture, and shook the administrative routines that had begun to form. Worse still, the effort to suppress it brought new rivalries among Arab forces, including tensions between groups arriving from North Africa and factions tied to the eastern provinces. Civil conflict became a persistent condition. At the same time, far to the east, the Umayyad regime in Damascus was beginning to collapse. As central authority weakened, control over distant western provinces became increasingly fragile. Events in Spain cannot be understood without that larger upheaval. Since 661, the Umayyads had ruled as caliphs from Damascus, governing an empire that served Arab interests. The same complaints that simmered among Berbers in the far west also existed closer to the heart of power, but there, the discontented were not scattered tribal communities. They included experienced administrators, soldiers, merchants, and professionals from Persia, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. Once organized, such opposition could overturn a dynasty. That is what happened. In 750, a new ruling family, the Abbasids, seized power, claiming legitimacy through descent from the Prophet's uncle. The Umayyads were driven out, and Abbasid rule would dominate the caliphate for centuries. This change was more than a royal switch. It shifted the center of the Islamic world. Power moved away from the Mediterranean toward the east, a shift made visible when a new capital, Baghdad, was founded in 762. One effect was to make the Western territories, including North Africa and Spain, feel even more distant from the political and cultural core. Another effect was more dramatic for Iberia. The Abbasid victory created the conditions for an Umayyad survivor to establish an independent regime in Spain. The first Abbasid caliph pursued surviving Umayyads with ruthless determination. Among those who escaped was a young man named Abd al-Rahman. After a dangerous flight, he reached North Africa, then crossed into Spain in 756. In Córdoba, he managed to seize authority. Later, history would treat this as a decisive moment, the founding of a new Umayyad state in the west. But in its own time, it did not look inevitable. The peninsula had already been shaken by factional conflict since the Berber revolt, and Abd al-Rahman appeared at first as one more contender in a violent scramble for power. Whether he would endure or be destroyed like others was not clear. In the end, Abd al-Rahman did endure. He survived for more than 3 decades after his arrival, and during that time he slowly expanded and stabilized his rule. Even then, control did not come quickly. Toledo and its surrounding region were brought under his authority in the early 760s. Yet challenges there continued well into the 780s. The southwest did not become secure until the mid-70s. The northeast and the Ebro Valley remained difficult, and only toward the end of the 70s did his influence reach those areas, and even then it was precarious. The Umayyad state in Spain was built step by step. It required constant vigilance, and for many years it remained exposed to rebellion, rival leaders, and shifting alliances. The later strength of the regime should not obscure its early fragility. This weakness created opportunities for Christian neighbours in the north. The small principality founded in Asturias became more than a refuge. Under Alfonso I, who ruled from 739 to 757, and under his son Fruela I, raids and destruction were carried out in the region between the Cantabrian Mountains and the Duero Valley. Many inhabitants were forced or compelled to move north into safer zones such as Asturias and Galicia. The result was twofold. The northern principality gained manpower, and a sparsely populated buffer zone emerged between Christian north and Muslim south, a frontier landscape that would shape centuries of conflict and settlement. One major shift accompanied these changes. Under the Visigoths, Toledo had been the central seat of authority. Under the Umayyads in Spain, Córdoba replaced it. In this, Spain mirrored the wider Islamic world, where Abbasid rule had moved the center from Damascus toward Baghdad. In Iberia, political gravity shifted from the interior plateau to fertile Andalusia. At the same time, the Christian world's center of resistance moved toward the northern mountains. From the 8th century onward, the peninsula can be imagined, for long periods, as divided into 3 broad horizontal zones, whose boundaries constantly changed. A Muslim south, a Christian north, and between them a frontier band of unsettled or thinly populated land. Charlemagne also became drawn into this frontier world, and his involvement ended badly. On the Frankish side, Carolingian power was expanding into Aquitaine, and under Charlemagne's father, Pippin, it pushed into Septimania. In 759, the inhabitants of Narbonne turned on their Muslim garrison and handed the city to Pippin. Carolingian authority now touched the Mediterranean and the Pyrenees. A move southward was only a matter of time. From inside Spain, another dynamic invited Frankish intervention. In the 700s, Abd al-Rahman tried to impose real control over the northeast, where local strongmen had entrenched themselves during the mid-century chaos. Threatened by Córdoba, some looked for external support. An appeal from Zaragoza helped bring Charlemagne across the Pyrenees in 778. The expedition collapsed. The governor who had invited him refused to open the city. Charlemagne withdrew. During the retreat through the western mountain passes, his rearguard was attacked and destroyed by Basque forces at Roncesvalles. The episode later became a monument of legend through the story of Roland, but in practical terms it was a sharp frontier ambush rather than a world-changing battle. Ironically, the main political beneficiary was Córdoba. In the following year, the Umayyad ruler secured Zaragoza and strengthened control over the Ebro Valley. Frankish pressure did not disappear. Under Charlemagne's son, Louis, appointed ruler in Aquitaine in 781, the Franks used divisions inside Al-Andalus to make more successful advances. This culminated in the capture of Barcelona in 801 and the creation of a frontier province in Catalonia under Frankish influence. Attempts to establish a similar arrangement in the Western Pyrenees were less durable. In that region, out of complex and poorly documented struggles, a Basque principality centered on Pamplona gradually emerged, later known as Navarre. The mood of the 8th century can be sensed through contrasting voices. A Visigothic scholar-bishop writing a generation before the conquest praised Spain as a blessed and beautiful land. A Christian chronicler writing amid the aftermath spoke instead of ruin beyond counting, a suffering so severe that no tongue could fully describe it. The 8th century was likely the harshest period in the peninsula's recorded past. It is also one of the least visible, since sources are few and difficult to interpret. The human cost cannot be measured. Still, the movement of refugees suggests widespread fear and upheaval. Some fled abroad. Some rose to prominence in foreign courts. Others settled in borderlands under new rulers. Among the better documented refugees is a religious figure known as Pirmin, now generally thought to have come from Visigothic territory north of the Pyrenees. By the 720s, he was active in the eastern Frankish lands, founding monasteries that also served as bases for Christian mission work beyond the Rhine. Another migrant, Theodulf, clearly of Iberian origin, joined Charlemagne's court in the late 8th century and became Bishop of Orléans, contributing to the revival of learning associated with Carolingian rule. These names survive because elites wrote about elites. Countless other refugees, humbler and anonymous, moved northward as well. In Catalonia, land grants for resettlement sometimes describe the settlers simply as Spaniards, meaning Christian migrants from the Muslim south. The worst turbulence seems to have followed the Berber revolt of 740 and the decades that came after it. Civil strife, breakdown of order, shifting of communities, vendettas, slave raids, and cattle rustling created conditions of deep insecurity. In frontier zones, vineyards and olive groves were abandoned. Roads and threshing floors were reclaimed by scrub. In ruined towns, collapsing stonework became part of daily danger. Some cities would not fully recover for centuries. The 9th century is slightly easier to glimpse than the 8th, yet even here the picture comes in flashes, rather than in a steady beam. The surviving records illuminate certain public events, but they pass over the most decisive transformation of all: the steady conversion of the local population of Al-Andalus to Islam and the slow formation of a genuinely Islamic society in the peninsula. Later centuries, especially the 10th and 11th, are far better documented, and by then it is unmistakable that a large share of the population was Muslim. The difficult question is how that change began, when it accelerated, and what forces gave it momentum. It is misleading to imagine the early conquerors as driven by missionary passion. Several reasons point in the opposite direction. To begin with, many of the Berber troops who crossed into Iberia were only recently and imperfectly integrated into Islamic religious life themselves. In addition, Islamic law recognized Christians and Jews as protected communities, people associated with earlier revelations. That recognition could be grudging and unequal, but it generally translated into tolerated worship, and there is ample reason to think that this arrangement usually held in Al-Andalus. Forced conversion was directed in principle at pagan idolaters, and by the time Visigothic Spain collapsed, such groups were not expected to exist as an organized presence. A further reason was financial. Non-Muslim subjects of a Muslim state carried a heavier tax burden. Early Islamic practice exempted Muslims from many regular taxes, apart from obligatory charitable giving, while non-Muslims paid poll taxes and land taxes that formed a major portion of state revenue. The treaty negotiated in the early years of conquest shows the system in action. From the viewpoint of government, widespread conversion could mean shrinking income. In that sense, the authorities had practical reasons not to press conversion too aggressively. Under such conditions, conversion would not primarily be the result of organized preaching campaigns. It would emerge through quieter pressures that rarely leave clean footprints for historians to follow. A shift might begin with a single influential figure, a prominent person in a household, a neighborhood, a village. A marriage into a Muslim family could bring one convert, then relatives and associates might follow. In towns, adopting Islam could open doors. It could improve access to employment, especially within a growing administration that required clerks, scribes, and intermediaries who could move comfortably within the ruling culture. Once a new order appears permanent, many people drift toward it, not from sudden conviction, but from calculation, ambition, and the desire for security. The process feeds on itself. As the older communities lose confidence, status, and numbers, the pressure to cross over increases. This kind of social migration into the dominant faith is familiar across history, and it likely shaped Al-Andalus as it shaped other regions under Islamic rule, from North Africa to Egypt. One serious attempt to measure the pace of conversion has tried to turn fragmentary medieval evidence into a workable model. The method, developed by the historian Richard W. Bulliet, relies on the way people are named in Islamic biographical collections. These works, common in the medieval Islamic world, often record family lineages in detail. In Córdoba, for example, a judge and scholar compiled a work on the city's judiciary that preserves extensive genealogical information. Bulliet noticed a repeating pattern. When a family line is traced backward generation by generation, a sequence of clearly Islamic names can suddenly give way to names that do not belong to Islamic naming traditions. In Iberia, those older names often reflect Visigothic usage. The point where the naming pattern shifts, Bulliet argued, marks the generation in which a family crossed from a non-Muslim identity into the Muslim community. From there, a second step follows. If enough genealogies are gathered and if an approximate length is assigned to a generation, the timing of those shifts can be translated into a broad curve showing the rise of conversion over time. The objections are obvious. Generations are not uniform in length. Family histories can be altered, simplified, or invented. Yet Bouliet argued that a large sample can smooth out these distortions and still reveal an underlying trend. In places like Egypt or Syria, the sample is extensive. In Al-Andalus, it is smaller, yet the curve produced from the available Andalusi material resembles the patterns suggested by better documented regions. If those findings are taken as a working hypothesis, the outline is striking. Around the year 800, perhaps only a small fraction of the indigenous population had become Muslim. By the mid-9th century, the share had risen, but still not dramatically. Then, from roughly the middle decades of the 9th century onward, the curve climbs rapidly. By around 900, it appears to have doubled. By the middle of the 10th century, it rises again. And by about the year 1000, it approaches a dominant majority, after which the pace levels off. On this model, the critical moment is not immediately after the conquest, but the period from the mid-9th century onward, when conversion seems to have surged. The question then becomes whether anything else points in the same direction. One possible clue comes not from texts, but from architecture. Córdoba's central mosque occupied a key site near the Roman bridge across the Guadalquivir. It was rebuilt on a monumental scale under the first Umayyad ruler of Al-Andalus toward the end of the 8th century. It was expanded again in the middle of the 9th century. It was enlarged further in the later 10th century and then expanded once more near the end of that century into a form that still dominates the city. Rulers extend grand religious buildings for many reasons: devotion, prestige, political theatre. Yet the simplest reason is often the most persuasive. A growing congregation needs space. The sequence of expansions across the 9th and 10th centuries fits neatly with the idea of a steadily increasing Muslim population, and the timing of the most significant additions aligns suggestively with the proposed surge of conversion. Another hint, darker and more unsettling, comes from a string of dramatic episodes in Córdoba in the middle decades of the 9th century. A group of Christians publicly denounced Islam and were executed under laws that treated such acts as capital offences. The first prominent case occurred in early June of 851, when a man named Isaac sought out the authorities and set in motion his own death. A Christian priest named Eulogius recorded the story soon after, and Eulogius himself would later be executed. Isaac's background is revealing. He came from a wealthy Christian family in Córdoba and received a high-level education, including fluent Arabic. As an adult, he entered government service and rose to an important post as a secretary, an unusually high position for a non-Muslim. Then, in the late 840s, he abandoned his career, withdrew to monastic life outside the city, and embraced a more intense religious path. A few years later, he returned to Córdoba and presented himself to the judge responsible for Islamic law. He pretended interest in learning the faith, listened as it was explained, and then launched into a deliberate verbal attack against the Prophet, and urged the judge to abandon Islam and become Christian. The judge reacted with shock and anger, struck him, then hesitated, wondering if the man was intoxicated or out of his mind. Isaac rejected the suggestion and insisted that he was acting with full intent, ready to die. After a brief imprisonment and consultation with the ruler's authority, he was executed. Several details matter here, not because this was a typical event, but because it exposes everyday realities. The sources mention almost casually. The son of a Christian family could grow up speaking Arabic and could enter the administration. Prospective converts could approach the judge for instruction, implying that such requests were not unusual. Eulogius and his circle also reveal a mood of anxiety, concern that Christian practice was weakening, that Arabic culture was attractive, that Islam was steadily gaining ground. That atmosphere matches the period in which conversion appears to accelerate. The extreme intensity of Isaac's behaviour also hints at the environment that shaped him. The monastery he had joined became associated with several such martyrdoms in the years that followed. It seems to have been a place where fear of cultural absorption and religious decline was sharpened into a crisis mentality. The martyr stories were also written in a style that echoes earlier Christian narratives of persecution, suggesting that older models of sanctity and suffering shaped how these events were understood and reported. How severe was the threat that such writers perceived? Their texts reveal a society in which boundaries could be surprisingly fluid. Mixed marriages between Muslims and Christians appear repeatedly. There are cases of conversion to Islam followed by a return to Christianity, and cases moving in the opposite direction. Families could contain different religious loyalties under one roof. These episodes are recorded because they ended in catastrophe, but the very frequency of such stories suggests that many similar situations existed without ending in execution. The movement of self-chosen martyrdoms was not embraced by all Christians. Prominent church leaders criticised it, and that criticism provoked Eulogius and his ally, Paul Alvarus, to write defences of the martyrs and insist that their deaths should be honoured as genuine sanctity. This polemical edge complicates the use of their writings as straightforward evidence, and their focus on Córdoba raises another limitation. Córdoba was the capital, the seat of power, the centre of administration. The countryside and other cities remained far more shadowed. What was happening in Zaragoza, or Seville, or Valencia, or Lisbon is far harder to know. Another response to the spread of Islam was not confrontation, but departure. Migration out of Al-Andalus was not new, but the 9th century produces more visible traces of it. Northern Christian principalities received waves of newcomers, including clerics and monks. In Galicia, for example, a monastic site that had once existed in Visigothic times was revived under royal patronage, and the leader brought in to restore. It was an immigrant from the Muslim south. Later, 2 monks arriving from Córdoba were placed in charge. Their move coincided with the very years of the martyr movement, raising the possibility that the atmosphere of tension played a role in prompting some to leave. Such migrants carried more than their bodies and their faith. They brought news, stories, relics, skills, and artistic habits. Over time, northern rulers cultivated a cult around the Córdoba martyrs, and even negotiated to obtain relics that shifted the spiritual centre of that devotion from the south to the northern court. Migrants also carried aesthetic traditions shaped by life under Islamic rule. Christian culture living inside Al-Andalus developed its own hybrid forms, distinctive church architecture, manuscript art, and decorative vocabulary that bore the imprint of an Arabized environment. Churches built by immigrant monastic communities in the north show these influences, and illuminated manuscripts produced by artists trained in that world display highly stylized figures and vivid colours that stand apart from other European styles of the same era. Alongside conversion, another quiet process was unfolding in the 9th century, an upswing in economic life. The 10th century provides clear evidence of prosperity in Al-Andalus, and in a world where growth usually moves slowly, such prosperity implies a longer period of preparation. Across the Mediterranean as a whole, historians and archaeologists detect a prolonged economic downturn from roughly the mid-6th century into the mid-8th, followed by signs of recovery that begin to appear in the later 8th century and gather strength in the 9th. The centuries that followed became a long phase of expansion. Al-Andalus fits this broader pattern. In an overwhelmingly agrarian world, such growth ultimately depends on rural stability. The countryside of Al-Andalus is the least documented part of the story, but the logic is straightforward. After the violence and disorder of the 8th century, improved stability in the 9th would allow farmers to work more confidently and intensively, especially in the naturally fertile south and east. Rural output supports towns. Towns support specialists, traders, and craftsmen. Over time, trade networks extend farther, drawing the peninsula into wider circuits of exchange. Stories from the period sometimes capture this widening horizon. One tale claims that a ruler of Córdoba acquired a famous necklace once owned by a caliph's household in the Eastern Islamic world. Whether the detail is true matters less than what the story expresses. The sense of renewed connection between Al-Andalus and the powerful cultures of the East. More solid evidence comes from geographic and commercial writing produced in the 9th century. A well-informed author writing for an Abbasid audience described the movement of slaves and furs across the Western Sea and into Eastern markets. The list of slave origins is revealing. It includes people from Slavic lands, from Greek regions, from Frankish territories, and from Italy. Some of this traffic could pass through other Muslim zones, such as Sicily. But it is difficult to imagine Frankish and Slavic captives reaching Eastern markets without routes that included Al-Andalus. Captives arrived by many means. Raids produced prisoners. Purchases did as well. One of the Córdoba martyrs of the mid-9th century had been born in southern France and captured as a child, then raised within Al-Andalus as a slave soldier. Farther north, merchants specialized in transporting enslaved people from Eastern Europe toward Western markets, and such networks likely existed earlier than the surviving evidence makes clear. Vikings also played a role, not only as raiders, but as traders. Andalusi sources focus on their attacks on coastal cities, yet raiding and commerce were intertwined. Vikings took captives, demanded ransoms, and also transported enslaved people for sale. Over the course of the 9th century, men and women from the British Isles, from Frankish lands, and from Slavic regions likely entered Iberian markets through these channels. Furs described in commercial records probably travelled along the same northern routes, carried from forests and Arctic regions down into the Mediterranean world. The use of enslaved or foreign soldiers inside the Andalusi military became a development of great importance. Here, Al-Andalus followed trends visible in the Eastern Islamic world, where rulers increasingly relied on professional troops, recruited from outside the dominant Arab elite. Calling such men slaves can be misleading, because military service often came with pay, status, and paths to advancement. The strategic purpose, however, is clear. A standing professional force reduced dependence on tribal warriors, whose loyalties were shaped by feuds and faction. An 11th century source credits one early ruler of Córdoba with creating the first professional corps, initially a mounted guard stationed near the palace. Over time, the force expanded enormously. By the middle of the 10th century, a large standing army existed, and its soldiers were widely known as men who spoke little Arabic, a detail that points directly to their foreign origins. Military reform was only one part of a broader pattern. The rulers of Córdoba increasingly copied the governing style of the Abbasid world. Administrative habits, court ceremony, control of luxury production, and the use of trained officials all moved in the direction of a more complex state. Contacts with the Byzantine Empire also appear, including diplomatic exchanges in the mid-9th century. Silk production became a ruler's monopoly, and luxury textiles were distributed as political gifts, mirroring practices long used by other sophisticated imperial systems. The first clear signs of a fully developed government office modelled on Abbasid practice appeared during the reign of the Amir Abd al-Rahman II in the early 9th century. A formal writing bureau operated beside the palace, staffed by professional secretaries who could produce orders, letters, and records in large numbers and at speed. One of those clerks was Isaac, the same man later remembered for his public defiance and execution. The presence of such a bureau shows how central the written word had already become to power. Around the same time, court life began to change in a different way. Ceremonies and rules of access were refined to make the ruler feel more distant and commanding, following etiquette that had spread through the Eastern Islamic world and had itself absorbed older Persian ideas of royal dignity. Authority was no longer expressed only through armies and taxes. It was also performed through distance, ritual, and controlled visibility. Abd al-Rahman II was also known for a cultivated taste that helped pull Córdoba closer to the cultural gravity of the East. Books circulated into Iberia from across the Islamic world, and his court gained a reputation for poetry, learning, and polished entertainment. One figure symbolized this transfer more than any other: Ziryab, a celebrated musician from the East, who arrived in Córdoba early in the reign. He created a training circle where young performers learned repertoire, technique, and style. Through him, Andalusi music absorbed Eastern forms and developed new variations. Later, tradition credits him with innovations to the lute and with helping shape musical taste so thoroughly that echoes of his influence outlived him. Yet his significance went beyond performance. He became an arbiter of fashion and social manners, teaching elite households how to stage dinners in the most current Baghdadi style, spreading new grooming habits, encouraging cleaner dental routines, and setting expectations about clothing and seasonal dress. For decades, until his death in the later 9th century, he served as a living conduit through which the refinements of Eastern Islamic court society were adapted to a Western frontier capital. By the time Ziryab's influence peaked, Córdoba itself had settled into a reputation for loyalty and order, but it had reached that point through violence. Earlier in the century, conspiracies and urban unrest had threatened the emirs. A plot in the city at the start of the 800s was met with exemplary punishment. Later, a serious uprising erupted in a suburb across the river. When it was crushed, the government responded not only with executions, but with an extraordinary act of urban erasure. The rebellious quarter was dismantled and its people were driven out. The space converted into cultivated land. After that, Córdoba largely stopped challenging the centre. Control had been made visible and unforgettable. Outside the capital, however, the situation remained far less tidy. Reading the political history of the period can leave the impression of constant provincial rebellion, as though the emirs spent their reigns stamping out fires in every direction. That interpretation is not wrong, but it can miss the deeper reality of the peninsula itself. Geography naturally encouraged fragmentation. In earlier centuries, Roman and Visigothic rulers had relied on local magnates who kept order in the provinces and linked remote communities to the capital. Umayyad authority, imposed after decades of chaos, had expanded slowly and unevenly. Even where Córdoba's power was acknowledged, it often rested on bargains with entrenched elites, rather than on direct administration. This was especially true in the frontier zones. Like the Frankish rulers beyond the Pyrenees, the Umayyads organised border regions as militarised districts, whose main purpose was defence. These marches formed a chain along the edges of Al-Andalus, and by the 9th century, 3 broad zones can be made out: a northeastern frontier around the Ebro Valley, a central frontier anchored near key strategic junctions, and a western frontier covering Extremadura and parts of what is now central Portugal. These districts were not run like the richer southern provinces. They were placed under commanders, men whose power came from troops, fortresses, and hard terrain, rather than from court ceremony. Distance mattered. A marcher commander lived far from the palace, governed poorer and less urban landscapes, and could easily behave like an independent prince. In such places, the refined world of music schools and fashionable banquets might as well have belonged to another universe. A family that illustrates this frontier pattern is the Banu Kasi. Their origin story claimed descent from a Visigothic noble who came to terms with the conquerors after the early 8th century invasion. But the evidence is too thin to verify such a lineage. What is clearer is that they were not of Arab or Berber origin, and that their rise represents a local elite, adapting to the new order. Their earliest prominent figure appears around the end of the 8th century, when a leader with a mixed naming pattern emerged, combining an Islamic personal name with a Latin-derived family name. That blend is the kind of detail that hints at conversion within a line, and it fits broader arguments about how new Muslim identities took shape over generations. By the mid-9th century, the family held positions of authority in frontier towns, cooperating with Córdoba when convenient, defying it when opportunity appeared, and surviving because they were difficult to dislodge. One of their most formidable leaders, Musa ibn Musa, became the dominant figure of the Ebro frontier. He could fight alongside Córdoba's generals in one year and oppose the Amir the next. He was defeated and then reinstated, rebelled again, and still remained in control for long stretches. His power rested on geography, fortifications, and the reality that local rule could not simply be replaced by decree from the capital. He also navigated relationships with the Christian rulers to the north, including ties to the dynasty of Pamplona through marriage. His position was so prominent that contemporaries regarded him as a kind of third king in Iberia, standing between the Emir of Córdoba and the kings of the northern Christian realms. He even attacked Frankish territory, sacking Barcelona and taking noble captives. And the diplomatic gifts found in his camp after a defeat reveal that foreign powers treated him as someone worth managing through negotiation, rather than ignoring as a mere rebel. After Musa's death, Córdoba briefly regained control of the region, but the pattern repeated. His successors and relatives resisted again, enduring repeated expeditions from the south. In the end, it was not a single crushing battle that ended their dominance. It was political engineering. Córdoba encouraged splits within the clan and supported rival families, elevating new frontier lords to displace old ones. Even then, the solution was temporary. The new families that rose with Córdoba's help would later seek the same independence, proving that the frontier system itself tended to produce semi-autonomous rulers. A similar story unfolded in the western frontier around Mérida and Badajoz. A local leader named Abd al-Rahman ibn Marwan rose against Córdoba late in the 9th century. His family background suggests again a frontier elite whose roots lay in the peninsula rather than in Arab or Berber settlement lines. His rebellion was crushed and the walls of Mérida were dismantled as a warning. Yet even after surrender, he was not eliminated. He was brought to Córdoba and kept under a form of controlled supervision, even serving in military roles. An altercation at court, involving an insult and a blow from an official of higher status, pushed him back into revolt. He returned west, held out in a stronghold, and then was astonishingly allowed to resettle at Badajoz under promises of loyalty. Predictably, he used the opportunity to fortify the place and to reach out for help to the Christian king of the Asturias. He defeated a government army, captured its commander, and sent the prisoner north as a gesture to his ally. When larger forces threatened, he fled to the Asturian court for years, then returned to the west, and rebuilt his power. The political turmoil in Córdoba after the death of one emir and the succession crises that followed gave him room to entrench himself. For decades, his line ruled the region in practice while offering only nominal obedience to the capital, until Córdoba finally reasserted control in the early 10th century. These frontier struggles show how easily the outer zones of Al-Andalus could drift away from Córdoba's authority. But unrest was not confined to the margins. The most serious challenge erupted in the south itself, centered in the rugged hills near Ronda, where Umar ibn Hafsun rose from local conflict into prolonged resistance. He came from a landholding family and claimed a noble Visigothic ancestry, a claim that cannot be tested securely. What matters is that his family belonged to the local population and had adopted Islam earlier in the 9th century. After killing a rival in a dispute, he fled across the sea, then returned and established himself in a mountain fortress at Bobastro, overlooking a narrow gorge in wild terrain that favoured ambush and endurance. He began as a bandit leader, gathered followers, and repeatedly defeated expeditions sent to destroy him. Like other rebels, he surrendered at one point, was taken to Córdoba, and was drafted into military service. Like them, he never truly integrated into the court's world. Mockery from officials who viewed him as a newcomer to Islam and as socially inferior helped push him back into revolt. He deserted and returned to his stronghold, where he built something closer to a regional principality than a mere gang. Reports claim that he gained peasant support by shielding local communities from harsh demands by tax collectors and officials. Whether this is accurate cannot be proven, but the claim itself reveals how such leaders were remembered, as protectors against a distant government and as symbols of regional autonomy. Brutal countermeasures did not break him. His influence spread across a wide swath of southern Iberia, reaching toward the Mediterranean and down toward the Straits, and pressing inland toward important towns. He sought allies wherever they could be found. In North Africa, among rival Muslim powers, and among Christian rulers to the north. His power weakened only gradually. He survived into the early 10th century, and only after his death did internal family conflict make it easier for Córdoba to dismantle the regime. Bobastro finally fell in the late 920s. Ibn Hafsun's story has been interpreted in many ways. Some see him as an opportunistic fugitive who mastered the politics of banditry in rough country. Others treat him as the face of rural protest, a leader who exploited popular resentment against taxation and forced labour. Another view emphasises social status and ethnicity. A provincial outsider born into a family that had recently converted, scorned by an elite that traced its prestige to older Arab lineages. Yet another explanation focuses less on identity and more on structure. In a landscape of steep mountains and scattered strongholds, where local loyalties and feuds could be more immediate than loyalty to a distant court, rebellion could become a normal form of political bargaining. His religious identity adds another layer of uncertainty. When the fortress finally fell, later accounts claimed a church existed inside and that Ibn Hafsun had been buried in Christian fashion. Some chronicles even provide an exact year for a supposed conversion back to Christianity. But such details multiply the farther the sources stand from the events. Official propaganda from Córdoba described him as an unbeliever. Yet that label could refer less to a change of faith than to his alliances with rival Muslim factions. It is plausible that rumours of apostasy were spread deliberately to poison his reputation among followers and to justify harsh measures. With the evidence available, certainty is out of reach, because several of the major rebel leaders were drawn from local families, rather than Arab or Berber settlement lines. Historians often group these movements together as revolts of converts and their descendants. The argument is that newly Islamized elites faced barriers in status and patronage, and that their rebellions expressed resentment at being treated as second-class Muslims. On that view, the peninsula was experiencing tensions similar to those that had shaken the Islamic world earlier, when non-Arab Muslims demanded fuller inclusion. The outcome, in the long run, would be a society defined less by tribal origin and more by shared religion and culture, with institutions that looked increasingly Islamic in character, rather than improvised frontier rule. Yet the evidence resists overly neat conclusions. A frontier ruler like Musa ibn Musa hardly appears as a deprived outsider. He commanded territory, allies, and prestige. A figure like Ibn Hafsun does not look like someone who would have settled happily into a comfortable administrative career if only the court had offered him a better position. At the same time, the career of the Christian clerk, Isaac, shows that even non-Muslims could reach high office in the state's bureaucracy. The boundary between insider and outsider was real, but it was not a simple wall. It shifted by region, by family, by court politics, and by opportunity. Still, when the 9th century is viewed as a whole, the different strands begin to look connected. Conversion advanced, especially in cities. Episodes of martyrdom reveal anxieties about cultural drift and mixed communities. Emigration carried people, stories, and artistic habits northward. Trade expanded and linked Iberia to wider networks of luxury, slavery, and exchange. Government borrowed institutions and court style from the East while struggling to control frontiers that naturally produced semi-independent warlords. These processes were slow, overlapping, and uneven, but together they pushed Al-Andalus toward a more settled Islamic society. If Bouliet's model is roughly correct, Muslims were still a minority among the indigenous population around the middle of the 9th century, and only reached dominance much later. The countryside likely changed more slowly than the cities, just as earlier Christianization had spread unevenly across rural districts in late Roman times. Religious majorities therefore shifted not in a sudden wave, but over generations. In this long transition, the great mosque of Córdoba stands as the most famous symbol, not only of faith, but of a new public order. Its form was unlike the older Roman architecture of the city. It claimed open urban space, reshaped the city's centre, and embodied the confidence of the ruling culture. Inside it, Friday worship gathered growing crowds, and the preacher's platform offered a vantage point over a community that was visibly expanding. The building also functioned as a tool of instruction and messaging. Its surfaces were not meant to be bare. Text and proclamation belonged to its visual world, and the proximity of palace and writing bureau meant that authority could speak through architecture, ritual, and the written word at the same time. In a society still in the midst of becoming, the mosque announced what the state wished the future to be. By the opening of the 10th century, the mood changes. The long years of uncertainty begin to give way to something more controlled, more confident, and far more visible. In 912, the ruler Abd Allah died in his palace at Córdoba, and power passed to his grandson Abd al-Rahman III. Over the next half-century, the Andalusi state would reach the height of its authority, wealth, and international reputation. The same high standing continued under the next ruler, Al-Hakem II, and then under the effective government of the powerful minister Al-Mansur, known in later Western memory as Al-Manzur, followed by Al-Mansur's son, Abd al-Malik, both acting in the name of the young Caliph Hisham II. After this long high tide came a sudden breakdown early in the 11th century. From that point onward, the Córdoba-centered state would never again recover the brief status it had claimed in the 10th. A status that made it seem, for a time, like one of the great powers of the Western Mediterranean. The new ruler's own background tells an important story about Iberia at this moment. Abd al-Rahman III was not the image of an isolated Arab dynasty ruling over a foreign land. His family connections ran through the peninsula itself. His father was born from the union of Abd Allah and a Christian princess from the Pyrenean world, a daughter of the Navarrese royal line who had been brought to Córdoba as a hostage decades earlier. Abd al-Rahman's mother was also Christian, a captive who had entered the court as a slave concubine. In immediate ancestry, the caliph was largely Iberian, with strong ties to the Basque north, and only partially Arab by descent. Contemporary descriptions emphasize features that did not match the stereotype of an Eastern ruler: light skin, blue eyes, and reddish hair. It was even said that he darkened his hair to appear more recognizably Arab. Whether every detail is accurate or not, the point is clear. Image mattered, and Abd al-Rahman understood how to craft it. He built that image with titles, ceremony, and a carefully staged public presence. He chose an honorific name that proclaimed him a victorious defender of the faith. More dramatically, he publicly adopted the titles of Caliph and Commander of the Faithful, a claim announced in a formal setting during Friday worship in Córdoba on the 16th of January, 929. These were not casual words. In the ideal theory of Islam, only one caliph should exist, since the office implied succession to the prophet's authority in the community. To claim it in Iberia was to raise the stakes of legitimacy and to speak not only to subjects at home, but to rivals beyond the sea. Around these titles grew a daily world of protocol that could baffle visiting envoys. Controlled access to the ruler, strict court routines, and elaborate ceremonies that made power look distant and majestic. When Abd al-Rahman personally led major expeditions, the departures themselves became public theatre, with standards displayed, troops assembled on a designated field outside the city, and the ruler presented as both commander and sacred guardian. Official newsletters celebrated victories. Court poets praised piety and strength. A new tool of power also appears more clearly in this reign: the state-sponsored writing of history. Abd al-Rahman seems to have been among the first of his line to keep an official chronicler, whose role was to record his deeds in the language of triumph. That official record has not survived as an intact, original work, but large sections were preserved by later historians, especially in Córdoba itself. Because of this, far more is known about Abd al-Rahman III than about any earlier ruler of Al-Andalus. Yet the same abundance creates a problem. Much of what survives comes from circles close to government, or from writers who relied on government accounts. Such narratives tend to praise the ruler, justify his policies, and present success as inevitable. Independent checks are rare. Any modern retelling has to treat the sources with caution, aware that propaganda can be woven into the very fabric of the story. What the surviving accounts emphasize above all is war. Power in 10th century Córdoba was asserted on two major fronts. One lay within the peninsula, against the Christian states of the north. The other lay across the water in North Africa, where control of ports, alliances, and sea lanes mattered as much as land campaigns. The evidence is uneven, and the peninsular wars are described in far greater detail than the maritime struggles. Even so, it is quite possible that the African arena carried greater strategic weight than the northern one. Iberian wars brought prestige, plunder, and leverage. North Africa brought something more fundamental: security for trade routes, control of the Western Mediterranean and influence over the Berber world that had always been tied to Iberia by geography. The African situation had changed sharply in the early 10th century, and understanding that change requires stepping back into the wider story of the Islamic world. In the generations after the Prophet's death, the community split into Sunni and Shiite traditions. The original dispute concerned where legitimate authority should rest, but it quickly produced difference in doctrine, ritual practice, and political loyalty. Over time, Shiite missionary networks spread quietly across the Islamic world, recruiting supporters in ways that are often hard to trace precisely. Late in the 9th century, one such movement gained traction in the Western Maghrib. The result was the emergence of a new state whose leader proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the Guided One, in 910. His dynasty became known as the Fatimids, claiming descent from the Prophet through his daughter Fatima, a claim rejected by Sunni opponents. In 912, the Fatimids founded a new capital on the Tunisian coast, positioned perfectly to expand along the narrow, habitable strip between desert and sea, and to strike at islands and shipping across the Mediterranean. In this context, Abd al-Rahman's adoption of the caliphal title in 929 takes on sharper meaning. Some have suggested it was meant as a declaration of independence from Baghdad, where the Abbasid caliphs still ruled. But Iberia had been effectively independent from Eastern control for generations, and Baghdad was far away, both politically and practically. The more plausible target was closer: the Fatimids. Two rival caliphs could not both claim universal authority without conflict. Abd al-Rahman's new titles can be read as an answer to Fatimid claims, designed to defend loyalty in the Western Islamic world and to prevent the Berber populations of the Maghrib from being drawn into a competing orbit. The threat was not only ideological, it was also economic. The trading networks that had grown across the Mediterranean in the 9th century depended on relatively safe sea lanes, and any power with strong fleets could disrupt them. On land, the rise of a new state in North Africa also mattered because it touched the long caravan routes running south into the Sahara. By this period, a major corridor linked southern Morocco to the Niger region in the direction of Timbuktu. Across that route moved commodities that strengthened rulers in the north: gold and enslaved people above all. A hostile power in the Maghrib could interfere with these flows, weaken Córdoba's revenues, and challenge the foundations of its military and political strength. Abd al-Rahman III answered with a classic mixture of diplomacy and force. He cultivated relationships with Berber leaders, offering gifts, recognition, and support to keep them from drifting toward Fatimid influence or becoming safe havens for rebels. At the same time, he invested heavily in maritime infrastructure to ensure a strong presence in the Western Mediterranean. Fortresses and watchtowers were built along key coasts. Dockyards and naval arsenals were developed, including facilities at Tortosa near the Ebro, likely chosen for access to timber. Other ports functioned as bases for fleets and patrols, stretching along the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic facade. The Atlantic outposts carried an additional logic of their own, especially at moments when raiders from northern seas threatened coastal settlements. Abd al-Rahman also secured footholds on the African side of the straits, taking key ports that allowed fleets to operate more aggressively and intelligence to move more quickly. Trade and spying intertwined. Merchants could carry political information as easily as goods, and courts paid attention to both. In the end, Fatimid power pivoted east, rather than pressing deep into the far west. In 969, Fatimid armies seized Egypt, and soon a new capital rose there, Cairo, shifting their focus toward the Middle East. After that, North Africa west of Egypt mattered less to their core strategy, than the contests of Syria, Iraq, and the eastern Mediterranean. Yet, Córdoba did not relax. A prudent government understood that the Maghreb could change quickly, and that threats sometimes return in new forms. Later, rulers in Iberia would not always show the same caution, and the consequences would be severe. While fleets watched the straits and diplomats negotiated with Berber chiefs, the peninsular frontier remained a constant arena of pressure. Northern campaigns were launched regularly, and the Arabic term for these expeditions entered Iberian languages as a word meaning campaign or seasonal raid. The Christian polities that had begun as small refugees in the 8th century had grown steadily by using Muslim political weakness and internal division. Their expansion pushed the unsettled frontier zone southward. Along the eastern Pyrenees, a cluster of small Catalan principalities existed, under a fading Frankish shadow. Barcelona was the most important among them, effectively independent by the 10th century, despite nominal ties to the old Carolingian world. Farther west, the Basque kingdom of Pamplona, or Navarre, gained strength and looked south toward richer lands along the upper Ebro. Nearby, Aragon began to form as its own power. In the northwest, the old Asturian kingdom had expanded so much in the 9th century that its rulers shifted their centre of gravity south across the mountains to Leon, and the kingdom took its new name from that city. Within the Leonese realm, the county of Castile was emerging as a distinct force in the upper Ebro lands. Over the 10th century, Castilian counts would steadily loosen dependence on Leon. These were the principal northern targets for Córdoba: Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and the Catalan counties. One campaign early in Abd al-Rahman's reign illustrates both the method and the message of this warfare. In the summer of 920, an expedition pushed deep into contested northern lands. It culminated in a major clash near Valdejuanquera, not far from Pamplona, on 26th of July. Large battles were not the everyday pattern of frontier war, which more often consisted of raids, sieges, and devastation. But here the Christian forces suffered a heavy defeat. Christian writers, shaken by the scale of disaster, recorded brief comments that reveal the tone of grief and moral explanation. Losses were interpreted as punishment for sin. There was talk of widespread slaughter. Towns such as Burgos were ravaged. 2 bishops were reportedly captured, and a young relative of one was later sent as a hostage to Córdoba to secure release. That boy's story ends with execution years later, remembered as martyrdom in Christian tradition. The Christian accounts are spare, but their emotional colouring is clear. The event was humiliating and terrifying. Muslim narratives, preserved and expanded by later historians, offer a far more detailed itinerary. Departure ceremonies, camping points, the appointment of trusted officials to key towns, the destruction of fortresses, and the striking of religious sites. The ruler is presented as commander in person, leading a justified war, advancing methodically, burning and breaking strongholds and pushing far into enemy territory. In this version, 2 Christian rulers brought their forces together to confront the invaders, were thrown into confusion and fled toward a fortress where they were trapped. The fortress fell after siege and assault. The campaign then continued through other northern regions, and the army returned to Córdoba in triumph after roughly 3 months. Later, writers add vivid lines about towns left charred and ruined, and they describe the gruesome logistics of carrying home trophies from the battlefield, including severed heads intended for display. Behind the dramatic storytelling lay practical motives that shaped nearly every major campaign. The first was frontier management. From Córdoba, the growth of Navarre toward the upper Ebro might look like a local irritation rather than a mortal danger. A ruler could, in theory, leave such matters to frontier lords. But there was a risk in letting marcher families win too much glory and power through successful warfare. The 9th century had shown how frontier magnates could become effectively independent. A strong ruler did not want to create another overmighty regional dynasty by giving it a free hand. A royal expedition was therefore not only about punishing northern enemies, it was also about reminding Córdoba's own commanders who truly commanded. Even the administrative details in the narrative matter here. The campaign became a stage for patronage, allowing Abd al-Rahman to install loyal men as governors in strategic towns and to tighten the state's grip on potentially unstable zones. The second motive was wealth. Campaigning was a revenue stream. Armies lived off the land. Towns and monasteries could be plundered. Horses, food stores, metal, and captives could be seized. The ruler's treasury benefited, and soldiers were rewarded, reinforcing loyalty and morale. In that light, one reported feature of the Val de Junquera episode stands out: the killing of large numbers of captives. The numbers given in some accounts are suspiciously round and grow larger in later retellings, which raises doubts about literal accuracy. In many cases, high-ranking prisoners were worth more alive than dead, since ransom could be enormous and sale into slavery lucrative. Mass execution typically required a special justification, such as claims of treachery or violation of accepted wartime conventions. If such accusations existed here, the narratives do not clearly explain them. What can be said with confidence is that captive-taking, ransom, and enslavement were normal features of frontier war and formed part of its economic logic. A bishop, in particular, could command a very large payment. Regular campaigns, year after year, helped keep the machinery of state funded. This pattern was not unique to Iberia. Across Europe, rulers financed power by predatory pressure on neighbours. Kings in the German lands battered Slavic regions for tribute and captives, and their campaigns carried the same mix of profit and prestige that characterized Córdoba's warfare in the north. The difference in Iberia was the religious frontier, which allowed victories and defeats to be framed as sacred struggle and moral judgment on both sides, even when the practical goals were often very worldly. Military fortune, however, was not always on Córdoba's side. In 939, a Leonese army under Ramiro II inflicted a devastating defeat on Abd al-Rahman at Simancas near Valladolid. The ruler narrowly escaped. His tent was taken, along with symbols that mattered deeply: his standard, his armour, and even his personal copy of the Quran. After that shock, he never again led a northern campaign in person. The message is revealing. Even a strong ruler who understood the value of personal leadership could decide that the risk was too great once a major reversal had occurred. Despite such setbacks, the overall balance of power during the 10th century favoured Córdoba. After Ramiro's death, the politics of León became tangled in succession disputes. Rival claimants sought support from Navarre and Castile, and the northern kingdoms pulled at each other in competing alliances. Córdoba's diplomacy exploited these divisions with ease, turning some northern rulers into clients in practice even when they remained formally independent. Under Al-Hakem II, this influence continued, and under Al-Mansur it hardened into relentless pressure. Al-Mansur, ruling in the name of the young Caliph Hisham II, is credited with an extraordinary number of victorious expeditions against the north. Whether the precise tally in the sources is exact or inflated, the trend is unmistakable. The late 10th century saw a surge in aggressive campaigning. The most famous strike came in 997, when Al-Mansur's forces reached the far northwest and sacked Santiago de Compostela, carrying off the church bells as trophies to Córdoba. Those bells became a symbol in later memory, returned only centuries afterward when Christian armies eventually captured Córdoba and sent them back. In the 10th century, however, the point was immediate. Córdoba could reach almost anywhere in the peninsula, take what it wanted, and transform distant sanctuaries into proof of its dominance. The remarkable run of military success in 10th century Al-Andalus did not happen by bravery alone. It depended on preparation, supply, and a system that could keep armies moving season after season. Recruitment drew on several different streams. One was a form of provincial obligation. Each district under Córdoba's authority was expected to send a set number of men when a major campaign was called. Almost none of the day-to-day paperwork that once recorded how this worked has survived, so the system is hard to see in detail. Now and then, though, a stray document breaks the darkness. One surviving fragment from the 9th century, preserved in later historical writing, suggests the scale involved. A single province in the southeast could be ordered to supply thousands of cavalry for a northern expedition, while another coastal province was required to send only a few hundred. The imbalance makes sense if some local forces were tied down guarding shorelines and ports. As Córdoba's reach expanded in the 10th century and more territory came under firm control, the pool of men that could be demanded also grew. Yet the sources that describe these provincial levies often treat them with contempt, presenting them as slow to assemble, poorly trained, and unreliable under pressure. The second stream mattered far more. Córdoba relied heavily on paid soldiers and professional fighters. This trend had begun earlier with the growth of palace troops and elite units, and by the 10th century it had become central to the state's military power. These forces were filled in different ways. Some men arrived as volunteers from outside, attracted by salary and the prestige of serving a wealthy court. Warriors from the Berber world of North Africa were drawn in by the same logic, as were adventurers from Christian lands to the north who were willing to fight for wages. Many others entered service through a darker route. Captives taken in war could be absorbed into the armed forces, and so could enslaved people, purchased through the long trading networks that connected Iberia to North Africa and to ports far beyond. In Córdoba's own slang, some groups of African soldiers were nicknamed tangerines, reflecting how often they arrived through Tangier. However they were gathered, these were the troops the state trusted most. Disciplined, paid, and dependent on the ruler rather than on local loyalties. A third stream existed alongside this professional corps. Some men came as volunteers, seeking a period of religious warfare on the frontier, treating Iberia as a place where devotion could be proved with arms. Their numbers were probably modest compared to the paid forces, but their zeal could add energy to a campaign. In the wider Islamic world, the far western frontier had a reputation as a zone of constant struggle, a place where fighting was not just politics, but also a form of religious merit. Soldiers alone do not win campaigns without equipment, animals, and logistics. 10th century Córdoba could sustain war because it could manufacture and move the material of war at scale. Workshops near the capital were said to turn out bows and vast quantities of arrows with regularity, alongside shields and tents in annual batches large enough to supply repeated expeditions. Horse breeding was also organised. Stud farms were maintained in the fertile basin of the Guadalquivir, especially in the wet lowlands and marshes around the southwest, where pasture could support large numbers of animals. Transport, meanwhile, relied less on carts than many modern viewers might assume. Wheeled traffic was limited in much of the Islamic world at this time, so long-distance movement depended on pack animals. Camels imported from Africa were kept in drier zones between campaigns. Mules were prized even more for certain kinds of work, and island markets supplied many of them. A traveller who visited Al-Andalus in the mid-10th century claimed that the best mules anywhere came from Majorca. The speed with which armies could cross long distances, striking deep into northern territory and returning quickly, points to a supply system that worked. Sometimes, the state used the sea as part of this machine. If an objective lay far away and coastal bases were available, soldiers could be moved by ship to save time and preserve strength, as happened late in the century when forces were sent along the Atlantic to support a raid in the far northwest. The frontier itself was reinforced by chains of fortifications. Some were little more than a strengthened hilltop using the landscape as the main defence. Others were large, expensive, and designed for prolonged resistance. The most famous example is the immense fortress of Gormaz, rebuilt in the mid-10th century under Caliphal authority. Its scale and engineering were extraordinary for Western Europe at the time, comparable in ambition to the best military construction found in the Eastern Mediterranean. Strongholds like this were not simply walls, they were anchors for garrisons, storehouses for supplies, and symbols of the state's ability to hold ground. Supplying such a military system meant stimulating a whole web of crafts and trades: metalwork, leatherwork, carpentry, textile production, animal breeding, shipbuilding, transport services, and the administrative work needed to pay and provision professional troops. The pull of Córdoba's demand could be felt across enormous distances. Some of what the state required came from North Africa, some from the far north through trade routes that reached into Viking spheres, and some from deep sub-Saharan routes, where gold and enslaved people were drawn into Mediterranean markets. Only a very rich government could pay for fleets, fortresses, embassies, and repeated large campaigns. A contemporary authority claimed that annual public revenues toward the end of Abd al-Rahman III's reign reached around 6.5 million gold dinars from the state mint at Córdoba. The figure sounds staggering, but without a clear map of prices and purchasing power, it is hard to translate into modern terms. What matters more is that multiple witnesses describe an economy that felt strong, liquid, and expanding. One mid-10th century traveller wrote with the confidence of someone who had seen other regions and could compare. Another key witness came from within the Christian community living under Islamic rule. A cleric who served the government as a diplomat, travelled as far as the German court, and later became a bishop in the southeast. Around the year 960, he commissioned a detailed calendar that preserves practical information about farming and seasonal work. Together, these voices help reveal one of the quiet foundations of Córdoba's power: agricultural transformation. Al-Andalus was part of a wider shift, sometimes described as an early medieval green revolution across the Islamic world. One element was the spread of new crops. By the middle of the 10th century, Iberia was growing and consuming plants that had arrived through long-distance connections and careful acclimatization. Rice and harder varieties of wheat became important. So did sorghum, sugarcane, and cotton. Orchards expanded with citrus, and gardens with vegetables that would later feel inseparable from Mediterranean cuisine. Bananas, pomegranates, and watermelons appear in the record, alongside spinach, artichokes, and eggplant. Some of these crops were not only food but also profit, turned into cash crops for export. A rare anecdote offers a glimpse of how risky and personal these introductions could be. A court envoy travelling to the eastern Mediterranean admired a particular variety of fig and smuggled plant material back home despite strict controls. He hid it among his books, endured searches at departure, then planted it in Córdoba and nurtured it until it bore fruit. When it succeeded, he presented the first harvest to the ruler and admitted the method by which he had obtained it. The story is small, almost domestic, but it captures something larger. Botanical experimentation was tied to diplomacy, travel, and court patronage. By the early 11th century, figs exported through Malaga were reaching markets as distant as Baghdad, proof that Iberian agriculture had become woven into the wider commercial world. The other major element of this agricultural shift was irrigation. Water management existed in Iberia long before the conquest, but in Al-Andalus, irrigation spread more widely and became more technically ambitious. Systems were improved, expanded, and standardized, especially in fertile coastal and riverine zones. In the east, the irrigated belt around Valencia became famous for its water distribution rules and its long-lived institutions for regulating access. The technology that made wider irrigation practical included water-lifting devices that raised water from rivers, wells, or cisterns into channels before distribution. These mechanisms were relatively cheap to build and maintain, and they spread rapidly. Later, writers would claim extraordinary numbers of water wheels in the Guadalquivir Valley, whether or not the totals are literal. The important point is that irrigation became a visible feature of the landscape. The economic consequences were profound. Crops like rice could feed large populations. Hard wheat stored well and tolerated drier conditions better than softer bread wheat. More fruit and vegetables meant healthier diets. Irrigation extended the growing season, reduced dependence on unpredictable rainfall, and made output steadier. Greater stability meant better planning and more willingness to invest. When yields rose and supplies became more reliable, towns could grow because the countryside could support them. A more productive rural economy also meant more taxable surplus. Some sources describe taxation as relatively light and markets as active, with land and labour changing hands more freely than in many parts of contemporary Western Europe. Political stability, at least compared to the chaos of earlier centuries, helped sustain the pattern. The overall effect was likely a healthier population and the conditions for demographic growth, even if exact numbers cannot be recovered. Most historians agree that the population of Al-Andalus rose during this period, but the scale cannot be measured confidently. One of the clearest signs is the flourishing of city life. Agricultural surplus could feed specialized urban labor, while demographic pressure could push some rural families toward towns in search of work. In the 10th century, industries multiplied. Mining and metalwork, ceramics and glass, woodworking and leather, textile production in wool, linen and silk, papermaking and book production, ivory carving, and many more. Some exports were raw materials. A famous mercury source in central Iberia supplied markets across the Islamic world. Manufactured goods also travelled widely, and textiles seem to have been especially prized. A traveller praised Andalusi dyeing as extraordinary, and the statement carries an implied map of trade, because some dyes had to be imported from extremely distant regions. A surviving business letter from around the year 1000 shows Jewish merchants in Egypt trading exotic dye woods from India westward to Iberia. That single detail reveals how deeply the Andalusi economy was plugged into Afro-Eurasian exchange. Among all Andalusi cities, Córdoba stood apart. Later centuries were devastated, and the contrast between its peak and its fall tempted writers into romantic exaggeration. The safest approach is to listen to the sober voice of a contemporary observer. One mid-10th century traveller described Córdoba as the largest city in Iberia, unmatched in the Maghreb, and comparable even to the greatest urban centres of the eastern Mediterranean. He praised its markets, its cleanliness, its religious architecture, and its dense network of baths and hostels. He reported that people from Córdoba who had visited Iraq compared their city's scale to a major district of Baghdad. He later hedged, suggesting Córdoba might be somewhat smaller than Baghdad, but not by much. Modern estimates of population are largely educated guesses, often circling figures around 100,000. Whatever the exact number, Córdoba was immense by the standards of Western Europe and belonged in the same urban conversation as Constantinople and the greatest eastern cities. The core of Córdoba was the old Roman walled nucleus, whose stone walls and gateways impressed visitors used to softer materials elsewhere. Walking the circuit of the walls could be done quickly, and from the ramparts the suburbs and gardens spread out in every direction. The walled centre along the Guadalquivir was dominated by government. The main mosque, the palace complex, the administrative offices, the mint, barracks, and the residences of high officials. Beyond this official heart, suburbs extended northward in a great sprawl of housing, workshops, markets, bathhouses, cemeteries, and gardens. Over time, the dense suburbs faded into a ring of market gardens and country estates on the slopes above the city. The river itself was crossed by a grand Roman bridge, still standing today. The southern bank remained less densely occupied than the northern side, partly because an earlier rebellion had led to the clearing of settlement there. By the 10th century, it contained large cemeteries, a leper colony, and scattered rural residences. One estate on the riverbank became famous in court circles. Built originally by a senior advisor in the 9th century, it later became associated with the celebrated musician and cultural figure Ziryab. In the 10th century, it belonged to the Caliph and served as a high-status residence for visiting dignitaries, including envoys from the Byzantine world. Yet the greatest architectural statement of the age was not within the old city. In 936, Abd al-Rahman III began building a new palace city outside Córdoba, conceived not as a villa but as a centre of government worthy of a caliph. The site chosen lay on rising ground west of the capital, overlooking the Guadalquivir Valley. It became known as Madinat az-Zahra. Excavation has revealed enough to understand why it astonished contemporaries. Vast terraces, grand halls, rich decoration, and carefully planned administrative spaces. The project demanded enormous labour and huge resources. Stone was quarried and reused from older ruins. Marble was imported from North Africa. Artistic objects and skilled craftsmen were sought from abroad, and Byzantine influence can be traced in the style of some decorative elements. The palace was designed to communicate something that could be understood without translation. The Caliph ruled from a place built to overwhelm the senses. Stories about the palace emphasize spectacle. One famous tale describes a throne hall lined with finely cut marble and a device intended to create an almost supernatural effect, with reflected light flashing across the room to dazzle visitors. Whether every flourish is literally true matters less than what it signals. The court wanted outsiders to repeat these stories because the stories themselves were a weapon. They made the caliph seem untouchable, rich beyond measure and capable of turning architecture into theatre. Other claims describe a massive household staff, extensive menageries, and gardens and ponds so large that daily feeding became a story in its own right. Even if the numbers are inflated, the underlying reality remains. This was a palace city built by a state with extraordinary resources. Madinat az-Zahra was not only a residence. By the time a mid-century traveller visited, much of the administrative machine had been transferred there. Government subsidies encouraged construction of houses and service quarters. Markets, workshops, stables, mosques, and baths followed. Merchants and craftsmen arrived to profit from a new centre of spending. The road between Córdoba and the palace filled with continuous development, turning the corridor into an urban ribbon that linked old city and new capital. A glimpse of how bewildering this world could appear to outsiders survives in the account of a German embassy to Córdoba. In 953, the German king Otto I sent an abbot from Lorraine, John of Gauze, to negotiate cooperation against piracy in the western Mediterranean. The mission quickly ran into trouble because the letters carried by the envoys contained language offensive to Islam. The Caliph could not publicly receive such a delegation without dishonour, yet the envoys could not return home without completing their task. The result was a long diplomatic stalemate. Intermediaries were brought in. A high-ranking Jewish court figure and a Christian bishop helped manage the crisis and arrange a solution. Eventually it was decided that a new envoy should be sent back to Germany to secure revised, more tactful letters. The man chosen was the experienced diplomat bishop from Elvira, a servant of the state who had already proven useful in delicate negotiations. Time dragged on, and the German envoys remained in a kind of controlled seclusion for years, unsure of their status and unable to force a conclusion. When the revised letters finally arrived, the German abbot was summoned to appear before the caliph. Even the details of preparation became part of the story. Instructions to cut hair, wash, and dress in a way considered suitable for a royal audience. The abbot refused to alter his monastic appearance, fearing it would be read as a change in character rather than a simple adjustment of clothing. The caliph sent money so the abbot could purchase proper garments, but the monk insisted on remaining in his black habit and using any gift for the poor instead. The response attributed to the caliph is revealing. Instead of taking offence, he is shown admiring the monk's firmness and stating that he would receive him even if he came dressed in sackcloth. The narrative is shaped to display two kinds of dignity at once: monastic stubbornness and caliphal self-confidence. The procession to the audience was staged as spectacle. The route was lined with crowds and military displays. Infantry stood with spears upright. Others practiced javelin maneuvers. Mounted troops showed off speed and control. The message was clear. This court was protected by disciplined force. The envoys were led along a dusty summer road toward the palace complex, where the outer spaces were draped with luxurious carpets and textiles. Inside, the caliph was presented as remote, seated alone in a posture that northern Europeans found unfamiliar, reclining on a richly adorned couch, rather than sitting on a chair throne. The account claims the caliph extended his hand to be kissed, a gesture portrayed as an unusual honour. The entire scene is filtered through a northern Christian lens, half astonishment and half unease, but it still conveys the intensity of Córdoba's court culture. Power performed as ritual. This embassy story also hints at the web of communities involved in running the caliphate. Jewish elites could serve as key court officials and diplomats. Christian officials could rise high enough to handle sensitive negotiations and travel to foreign rulers. The machinery of government did not function as a simple closed circle. It relied on expertise, languages, and networks that crossed religious boundaries, especially in diplomacy and administration. The world of gifts and patronage behind this court was equally staggering. A surviving list of offerings made by one of the most powerful men in Al-Andalus gives a sense of how office and favour could be purchased. The list includes enormous sums in gold coin and bullion, great quantities of silver, luxury textiles, furs from distant regions, horses including prized Arab mounts, tents and high-grade furnishings, raw materials for state-controlled textile production, prayer rugs and hanging fabrics, enslaved servants, and even building stone and wood suited for the caliph's construction projects. Some of the items are everyday luxuries for the wealthy. Others are strategic resources that feed directly into state monopolies and military capacity. The scale of the gift makes one thing unmistakable. The caliphal court was a place where wealth could be converted into authority, and authority displayed itself through objects, architecture, and controlled access to the ruler. Otto I's mission, led by John of Gauls, was only one episode in a steady flow of visitors to Córdoba. German rulers continued to reach out. A second message arrived from Otto II in 974. Envoys from Constantinople appeared more than once, including delegations in 949 and again in 972. From the Western Mediterranean came other approaches. In 942, an ambassador from Sardinia arrived, and with him travelled merchants from Amalfi, a southern Italian port, whose wealth depended on shipping and trade. Their interest was predictable. Whoever wanted safe routes, predictable agreements, and access to markets had reason to talk to the strongest court in the region. At the same time, contacts never stopped with closer neighbours. Córdoba constantly dealt with Christian powers in the north of Iberia and with Berber leaders across the sea in North Africa. The court's foreign relations were not occasional spectacles. They were part of the state's daily rhythm. These meetings did not only settle practical questions like alliances, tariffs, or maritime security. Sometimes they carried ideas and texts that changed what scholars could do. One Byzantine embassy in the middle of the century delivered a lavish copy of a famous ancient work on plants and medicine, written by Dioscorides. For the court, this was a gift with real value, not just a showpiece. Dioscorides had tried to catalogue the healing properties of plants in a systematic way, and his book belonged to the foundation layer of ancient medical science. Yet when the manuscript reached Al-Andalus, the problem was immediate. Greek was not a working language for scholars connected to the palace. The court wanted the knowledge, but did not have an easy way to unlock it. A request was sent back to Constantinople, and a Greek monk named Nicholas was dispatched to Córdoba a couple of years later. At roughly the same time, another interpreter was found, an Arabic-speaking man from Sicily, a region that had its own long experience of cultures and languages meeting. Between them, Nicholas and the Sicilian intermediary explained the Greek text line by line to a small group of Andalusi scholars attached to the court. Among the listeners was Hasdai ibn Shaprut, already known in the sources as a diplomatic fixer and a trusted bridge between worlds. His importance, however, went far beyond arranging audiences and smoothing disputes. He served as the ruler's physician and was famous for medical skill across political and religious boundaries. In the 960s, he treated a Christian king from the north, Sancho of Leon, whose health problems had become a public issue. Far away in Egypt, a Jewish doctor attached to the Fatimid court dedicated a scientific work to him, an indication of reputation that crossed the entire Mediterranean. Hasdai also stood high within the international Jewish community. He supported poets and scholars, helped sustain learning institutions in the East, and maintained correspondence that reached into distant regions. He held influence at court not only because he healed bodies, but because he was useful in diplomacy, finance, and intelligence. For his service, he appears to have been rewarded through revenue streams linked to commerce, such as tolls and customs. His career shows what a cosmopolitan court could look like when a ruler valued competence and loyalty more than origin. The group gathered around the Dioscorides manuscript also points to something else. Intellectual life close to the palace was becoming more ambitious. In the Eastern Islamic world, Dioscorides had already been rendered into Arabic earlier, but that translation did not seem to have reached Spain in the first half of the 10th century. That gap explains the excitement in Córdoba when the Greek original arrived. The court wanted a direct connection to prestigious science, and it was willing to spend effort to obtain it. The same circle included other figures with practical and scholarly interests. Reshaped of Elvira, who worked as a diplomat and later became a Christian bishop, compiled a calendar rich in agricultural and botanical detail. A few years later, under the next ruler, a scholar named Ibn Juljul produced a commentary on Dioscorides. In other words, the Byzantine gift did not remain an exotic trophy. It became a seed for local work, teaching, and writing. This peaceful cultivation of learning depended heavily on patronage. In the medieval world, rulers did not gain glory only by winning wars. They were also expected to fund builders, artists, and scholars, and to make their court a place where knowledge could gather. Earlier leaders in Al-Andalus had often been too busy surviving rebellions and border wars to play this role consistently. By the middle of the 10th century, the balance had shifted. The state was richer, more confident, and more stable, and the court began to invest in culture with real intensity. The palace city outside Córdoba, with its decoration and imported materials, was one expression of this new confidence. The team assembled to interpret Greek science was another. Among all the rulers of the period, Al-Hakim II developed the strongest reputation for taking learning seriously. Al-Hakim's education had been carefully planned. From childhood, he was trained by high-level teachers and showed genuine intellectual drive. As ruler, he poured energy into one project above all: building a library in Córdoba that could rival the greatest collections in the Islamic world. Later, writers describe astonishing numbers. One claims that the catalogue alone ran to dozens of volumes. Another insists the library contained hundreds of thousands of books. Modern readers may doubt the precise totals, and it is wise to treat them cautiously. Yet there is firmer evidence behind the general picture. Books were acquired from as far away as Persia, and teams of copyists in Córdoba reproduced texts quickly. One detail stands out because it is unusual in the record. Among these scribes was a woman, Lubna, described as a poet and an accomplished copyist. As the ruler set the tone, the fashion spread. Wealthy officials and pious scholars began assembling private libraries, and Córdoba's streets contained not only markets and workshops, but also rooms where books were collected, copied, and discussed. The city's reputation for learning travelled fast. A young French scholar, Gerber of Aurillac, came to Spain in the 960s to study. The best evidence suggests his education took place mainly in monasteries of Catalonia rather than in Córdoba itself. Even so, a later chronicler reported that he had journeyed to Córdoba for wisdom. That claim is probably exaggerated, but it reveals something important. Within a generation, Córdoba had become a symbol, a place Europeans imagined as a centre of unusual knowledge. In that same climate, other sciences flourished under elite protection. Astronomy is the clearest example. The leading figure here was Masalama, later known as Maslama of Madrid, one of the earliest natives of that small frontier town to gain wide recognition. Born around the middle of the century, he gravitated to Córdoba and moved within the intellectual circles that clustered near the court. His most famous achievement was to adapt the astronomical tables created by a major Eastern scholar, Al-Khwarizmi, to the local meridian of Córdoba using observations made in 979. That kind of work mattered. It made inherited knowledge usable in a new place, and it required careful measurement rather than mere copying. Maslama also translated Greek scientific material into Arabic, including a work connected with Ptolemy, another sign of the ongoing absorption of ancient science through Islamic scholarship. He wrote a practical manual of commercial arithmetic, suggesting demand from merchants and administrators. he produced a treatise on the astrolabe, explaining how to construct and use the instrument that helped measure the sky and navigate both land and sea. He taught many students, and several became well known in the next century. He likely practiced astrology as well, which at the time was commonly treated as a serious discipline allied to astronomy. Later tradition even credits him with predicting the political turmoil that would shake Al-Andalus soon after his death. Of course, only a small number moved in those glittering circles close to the ruler, and fewer still possessed Maslama's talent. The sources tend to ignore the competent middle layers of society, the people who made a city function day by day. Yet there are glimpses. One of the best is the long medical lineage known as the Banu Zur, a family that became a dynasty of physicians. The first, clearly visible member appears in Seville near the end of the 10th century. His descendants studied, travelled, served courts, and wrote medical works across the next 2 centuries. One practiced on the Mediterranean coast, another returned to Seville to become chief physician to its rulers. Another served the Almohad caliphs later on and produced influential treatises. A later descendant became famous not only as a doctor, but also as a poet, leaving behind a haunting self-written epitaph that turns on a single bitter irony. A man who once saved others from fear of death finally becomes death's captive himself. Families like this did not emerge from chaos alone. Their rise required peace, wealth, education, and stable professional pathways. The caliphal 10th century created that environment for many skilled households whose names never entered chronicles. It would be misleading, however, to treat the 10th century as an age of perfect harmony. The society was far more stable than the fractured 9th century, and vastly less violent than the bleak years that followed the early conquest. Yet older strains persisted, and new ones formed inside the ruling elite itself. A sharp way to see those tensions is to watch what happened after Al-Hakam II died in 976. This is where Al-Mansur enters the foreground. He would become the most powerful man in the Western Islamic world. Not as caliph, but as the operator who controlled the state behind a young ruler's throne. Born in 938 near Algeciras into a family that claimed Arab descent, he was not an obvious heir to greatness, but he had education, ambition, and a sharp sense of how the system worked. In Córdoba, he studied under notable teachers, including at least one famous rhetorician from Baghdad, invited as part of the court's effort to import learning and polish. Al-Mansur began his career in the bureaucracy, climbing through modest posts that allowed superiors to notice his competence and his drive. His turning point came in 967, when he was entrusted with managing the estates and property of Sub, the favourite wife of the caliph. Sub herself had come from Christian lands in the north as a captive and had risen to immense influence inside the palace. Serving as her administrator gave Al-Mansur proximity to power and access to networks of patronage. From that moment, his rise accelerated. When Al-Hakam II died, Sub's son Hisham II inherited the throne as a child. Real authority fell to a small group acting in his name, and Al-Mansur secured a place among them. The early regency can be imagined as a three-way balance. One figure represented the senior administrative establishment, a minister who had risen high under the late caliph and was resented by rivals. Another represented military prestige, an older commander whose life had been shaped by frontier warfare and campaigns across the sea in North Africa. The third was Al-Mansur, younger, bureaucratic in training, and increasingly political in instinct. Each of them embodied a fault line. The general symbolized the world of garrisons and marches, where hard power mattered more than court ritual. The senior minister symbolized the palace bureaucracy and the fragile hierarchy of status. Inside Córdoba, Almanzor learned to use both worlds and to turn their tensions into ladders. Personal alliances formed and broke. Almanzor initially worked closely with the veteran general, even marrying into his family. Together, they moved against the senior minister. Under the surface, older prejudices also mattered. Although the state could elevate capable Christians and Jews to important roles, the highest directing posts tended to be dominated by men who claimed Arab lineage. Berbers, despite their huge military importance, were often treated with contempt in elite civil circles. Almanzor played these attitudes skillfully. He emphasized his own Arab pedigree and promoted a narrative that tied his family to the original conquest, framing his rise as the rightful return of an old conquering line. The senior minister, by contrast, was vulnerable to the gossip of being an upstart and to the hostility attached to Berber origins. By 978, the senior minister was eliminated, disgraced, and removed from the board. The partnership with the general lasted a little longer, but in 981 it collapsed into civil war. The older man died during the fighting, reportedly through an accident rather than a clean killing. That same period saw other developments that mattered as much as the intrigues. The young caliph was encouraged to withdraw from real government into a life of pleasure and seclusion, leaving the machinery of state in other hands. Almanzor began to build popularity in the army by leading campaigns and presenting himself as a man of action, not merely a clerk. He also built a vast palace complex east of Córdoba, a new administrative and ceremonial centre intended to rival the older caliphal palace city to the west. When he transferred the offices of government to his own complex, the message became unmistakable. The state still existed, but its true centre of gravity had shifted. From 981 until his death in 1002, Almanzor ruled in practice. The caliph remained alive, but authority belonged to the man who controlled appointments, finances, and the army. The most visible signature of Almanzor's era was relentless campaigning against the Christian polities of the north. The raids came so often that they began to look like a system, rather than a series of decisions. Cities and monasteries were struck repeatedly. Barcelona was sacked in the 980s. Fortified outposts in the west were plundered. Leon and Zamora were attacked. Monasteries were stripped and burned. In the mid-1990s, even a leading count of Castile was captured and died in Córdoba. Pamplona was attacked near the end of the century. In 997, the armies reached Santiago de Compostela in the far northwest, and the raid became legendary. Bells from the great church were carried away as trophies to Córdoba. The destruction continued into the early thousands, and on one of the final campaigns, Almanzor died while returning from operations in the Rioja, at Medinaceli. His death did not end the pattern immediately. His son Abd al-Malik inherited control and continued the same aggressive rhythm, raiding Catalonia, Castile, Leon, and Aragon in quick succession. Nothing suggests the policy would have softened if he had lived longer. The engine was still running. Christian chroniclers naturally framed Almanzor as a demonic scourge, a punishment sent against them. Islamic sources emphasized his piety. He carried a personal copy of the Quran on campaign, punished those accused of straying from accepted doctrine, and presented war as religious duty. Yet the record also shows how political and economic these expeditions were. Christian mercenaries served in his forces, and Christian nobles acted as guides. Without local knowledge, the army could not have navigated remote routes to targets like Compostela. Those helpers were rewarded with expensive textiles and gifts. The campaigns followed a logic familiar from earlier decades. Seize livestock, treasure, captives, and prestige, and force opponents into tribute. Churches and monasteries were attacked not because sacred buildings were the ideological enemy, but because they stored wealth. In many regions, monasteries functioned as secure depositories for valuables, a place where local elites kept precious metals and goods. Striking such a site was the medieval equivalent of hitting a vault. The religion of the guardians mattered far less than the contents behind the doors. What set Al-Mansur apart was the scale and the tempo. Campaigns came season after season with unusual intensity. The motive was not only glory. Money mattered, and so did the costs of power. Building a rival palace city, expanding major religious architecture, buying loyalty through gifts, reducing unpopular taxes, paying followers, bribing enemies, and above all, enlarging the army required enormous cash flow. Even if the treasury inherited from Al-Hakem II was indeed vast, the new regime burned resources quickly. War became a method of financing politics. The army itself changed under this pressure, and here lay a danger that would not be fully understood until it was too late. The earlier caliphs had already used troops recruited beyond Iberia, but under Al-Mansur, the influx of Berber forces from North Africa grew dramatically. Whole tribal units were transported across the straits and kept together under their own leaders. These formations became the backbone of Al-Mansur's personal power. That arrangement solved an immediate problem because it provided large, cohesive, loyal troops. It also created a long-term risk. These units entered a society where Berbers were still widely distrusted and often despised by segments of the urban population and by elites who claimed Arab descent. Because the units remained intact, their internal bonds stayed strong, reinforced by language and shared identity, and also by the hostility they encountered around them. Their loyalty attached itself less to the abstract institution of the caliphate and more to the man who paid them, protected them, and led them. When that man disappeared, the structure he had built could become unstable. In the process, the caliphate itself was weakened in a deeper way. Abd al-Rahman III had once elevated his rule by claiming the title of caliph, a claim that was always controversial in Islamic political theory, since in principle there should be only one rightful successor to the Prophet. Even so, the Córdoban Caliphate had functioned successfully for decades because it represented order, wealth, and effective authority. Al-Mansur showed that a caliph could be sidelined completely, while the state continued to operate. Hisham II lived for years after Al-Mansur and his son, but exercised no real power during his long reign. Once that fact was visible to everyone, the spell of legitimacy was harder to sustain. If authority could be pushed aside once, it could be pushed aside again by others.